Well, to answer your question, I've been fine, and nothing exciting going on over here.
Cool. Did you get any of the rain from the Mr. Harvey?
Nope, not even a little bit.
Wow. It's been constantly raining since probably Friday here in Austin.
Mhm.
Nothing's been super ridiculous here. I'm indoorsy streamer, so I haven't been out and about like driving and stuff, but
Mhm.
there's likely loads of flooding all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah, they were saying that it was just going to kind of hover along the coast,
Hmm.
so probably a good deal more on the way.
So, using that as a bit of a hook,
Uh,
there have been people who are talking about the economic impact of catastrophes like Katrina and like
mm,
Harvey and how much they require us to rebuild and invest a whole bunch, and also just the downtime of if people evacuate, they're not working their usual jobs and kind of contributing to the economy in that local region. So, what's the
yeah.
story on that? The economic impact of Harvey?
I've never read any studies really on the overall economic impact of natural disasters. Um, if I had to, off the top of my head, I would say that there probably isn't a lot of long-term impact, which is generally the type of impact that economic researchers are more interested in.
Hmm.
It's probably more of a one-off negative shock. Um, there's probably an event horizon beyond which there's enough destruction that there is a significant impact economically. That's kind of what happened with Galveston, Texas, which used to be a significant port in the United States until it was hit by a hurricane in what was like 1910 or something. And it never really regained its same status after that. It was never really as economically vibrant afterwards. I think a lot of the business shifted kind of to Houston because they
Mm.
have that weird port they developed on the whatever it is there at Bayou, I guess.
Hmm.
Yeah, so Galveston is pretty much a tourist town now rather than an actual industrial port city like it used to be at one point. So natural disasters can have a one-off negative shock significant enough to have long-term impact, but generally I don't think it's that common. I think for the most part, you just rebuild and things kind of return to form after a time.
Hmm. Yeah, we have a few viewers who are in Houston, and it's very, very flooded there. There were some people who said that they know people who have lost everything. And then on the flip side, you have some people who factor that in when they live in Houston in the first place. Like one of our biggest contributors to Vaxian, he just had a built-in generator in his house for situations like this where the power goes out in the area. He's going to be able to survive and self-sustain, and his house is like 4 feet elevated off the ground, so he's totally fine. He's kind of stuck, but he's not going to really be in much danger. So it's interesting seeing that, like, knowledge that if you're close to the Gulf, hurricanes are going to happen sooner or later. So either you can cut corners in the short term, and when it comes, you're just going to have to rebuild everything, or you can invest in stuff that, like we said before, you don't know when the hurricane's going to come, but you know that it's going to come eventually.
Yeah. Well, that kind of falls into the realm of adaptation. If you know there's going to be a recurring natural disaster every, whatever the period in between events is, then you know that you can invest a certain amount of resources into defense, basically, preparing for that eventuality.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's something you can see throughout history. In Bangladesh, it's every monsoon season, a good swath of the country is flooded. And so a significant part of the country's infrastructure, not maybe infrastructure isn't the right word, but basically the country's construction, the way they design buildings, the architecture, that's the word I want, has been designed over the centuries in a way that minimizes the damage done by that flooding. So a lot of the houses and whatnot are built kind of at elevation on stilts and whatnot,
Mm-hmm.
so that they aren't just wiped away in a flood. And population centers tend to gravitate more towards higher elevations. So Yeah, in a sense, that's kind of a modern technological adaptation, sort of the Western equivalent of that happening faster and in real time.
Mhm. How much do you think the Trump administration is going to kind of take a stance in aiding it? Because we have examples with what Bush was the president for Katrina, and kind of how he handled that. I don't know too much about that. Do you know? Like Bush versus Katrina, did he do the right thing? What did he do?
I don't know a whole lot about it because I didn't, again, as an economist maybe, but just in general, I don't always pay that much attention to natural disasters.
Mm-hmm.
I think the greater part of his problem was the what they call in political science optics, sort of the aesthetic of him kind of patting the guy that he'd appointed, or rather that he'd asked to be appointed, since he's appointed by Congress. The guy he put in charge of FEMA, he kind of gave him a pat on the back and said he was doing a heck of a job. And that was despite the fact that FEMA was really struggling with the load presented by handling the sheer scope of the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Some people criticized FEMA, probably legitimately, that there was more that could have been done, or what they did was not efficient. But given that FEMA has limited resources and limited manpower, I think any amount of well, basically they would have struggled regardless, is what I'm trying to say. So probably some fair criticism there, but also I don't know that there was really any chance that they were going to just handle it masterfully, given how big the problem was.
Yeah.
So part of it was that, and then there was just a lot of enmity against Bush in general by that point, because that was after he'd been reelected in 2004, so this was into his second term. And there was already an immense amount of dislike and suspicion on the part of the political left in the United States at the time against him, and so they saw an opportunity, basically, by the government struggling to cope with the disaster, and so they pounced. Mm-hmm. And it was immensely effective. Katrina and the fallout there, political fallout there, probably did more to damage the Bush administration than almost anything else up to that point. And I don't think the administration ever really recovered after that. So in that sense, it was kind of an important political event in terms of how it impacted the Bush administration and their ability to conjure political capital.
It's interesting, too, because especially for a situation like that, there isn't really an opportunity for a president to deal with more than one huge disaster and kind of get better at it. It's kind of like, we have an anomaly right now, we have to do something about this, or it's really going to influence your political career and your standing with the community and all that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's just like people blaming or giving credit to a president or other political leader for the state of the economy. Mm-hmm. Really, presidents and probably most political organizations or governments can't really do a whole lot about the economy. Obviously, that varies from country to country. But certainly in the United States, the president can't really do all that much to impact the economy. But they're always happy to take credit for it when it goes well, and when things turn south, the opposition always takes the opportunity to blame them. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's the same with natural disasters. I mean, if they'd handled it well, they would have taken full credit for it.
Yeah.
Even though it probably wouldn't have had much to do with the president himself, or maybe even his team, really. It would have had more to do with the actual professionals working the bureaucratic machinery of FEMA and the other disaster agencies. In turn, and what happened was that they didn't handle it that well, and so they got shit for it. Yeah, there's actually, in Myanmar, or Burma, as some people like to still call it in the West, a big part of their democratization over the past 5-6 years, part of the genesis of that was a huge, I think they call them typhoons over there. We call them hurricanes. Mm-hmm. There was a huge typhoon over in East Asia, and it dramatically impacted Burma. It did a lot of damage there. And the government, the military junta that rules Burma, had a really hard time handling it. And so, as part of the part of the fallout from that political fallout was that the government was significantly more delegitimized rather than it already was. And that incentivized greatly, along with some other factors. The government was getting afraid that they were becoming too dependent on China. They kind of wanted to balance the Chinese out a little bit. But also, the political fallout of that hurricane was part of what pushed them to democratize. So, in that sense, there's significant political impact to natural disasters, above and beyond the economic impact, which is generally temporary, even if it's a really bad disaster. We did have a question. How do you feel about Manaj-Bhargava energy generators for poor countries out of grid rural areas? I've never heard of Manaj-Bhargava energy generators, so I couldn't really tell you. I did a little Google search, and it looks like it's a like an exercise bike that generates electricity. That could be handy.
Mm-hmm.
If you live in a rural area that doesn't have significant electricity, then yeah. The only problem is you gotta have somebody to work it. I don't know who would want to do that for an extended period of time. I guess you could have villagers kind of tag team over the course of a day, maybe during the parts of the day in which you really need the electricity. So but again, I don't know anything about it, so I couldn't tell you how efficacious it would be in really bringing electricity to distant rural areas. Yeah, I know that it kind of reminds me of, what do they call it, micro-lending, which is popular in South Asia in particular. And basically, micro-lending is, it started out as kind of a, like an NGO, a non-profit activity. And the idea was to give loans, very small loans, to very poor people in countries or regions within a country that traditionally do not have access to capital, to financing from the banking sector. And so the idea was that they would have something to do, generate some business or other entrepreneurial activity that they would not otherwise be able to do for lack of financing. And it was meant to be a self-sustaining program. It was meant to basically, they were loans, not grants, so they would be paid back with interest. And the idea was the program could self-perpetuate. Basically, whoever got money, they would pay that back, and so then they could keep lending it out. And because they were getting interest back, the amount of money they had to work with would grow over time, and so they could expand operations at a natural pace. And the program had, mixed impact. In general, it's considered a pretty big success, but not everybody who got money ended up paying it back. So there were problems. I think the not rate of, what is the word? Default. The rate of default was relatively high, higher than I think the market average, but kind of to be expected. And I think they were expecting it too. And so they just factored that in. And so even though somewhat high default rate, overall still a success. They still ended up helping a lot of people. And I think there was another program kind of designed in that vein that was giving lighting. That was meant to give lighting to people who lived in slums that didn't have access to electricity, or who couldn't steal it anyway. It's very common to steal electricity in South Asia.
How do you steal it?
Huh?
How do you steal it?
Oh, it's not hard. You just run wiring basically from the power cables.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the power companies generally don't police their stuff very much, not least because it would be politically unpopular. I mean, it's poor people. Poor people are very numerous in South Asia, and so they form a potent voting bloc. And politicians are quite happy to cater to their needs and interests, when it suits them anyway. And so free electricity, of course, is a big vote winner. So whenever the electricity companies complain, politicians will go out of their way to make sure that they don't really go after the people doing the stealing. And it's not as hard as it would be otherwise, because I think in South Asia, India and Pakistan, most of the electric companies are state-owned, or at least heavily state-influenced. So pretty common for the poorer communities, especially in the slums. But not everybody has that, and so this NGO had this gadget, and I don't remember what exactly it was, but basically I think it was solar powered, and so it would charge up during the day, and then at night it would basically light up, give them light, so that they could keep working. That was the advantage. Normally they wouldn't be able to work at night because there wasn't any lighting. But this gadget would let them do that so they could make more money. That I don't remember if that was also a micro-lending project, but it's in the same vein. And the idea is the same as this energy generator, basically, to help poor communities that don't have access to financing or other advantages that wealthier parts of a given country would have. So, if the energy generators work, that's great, but it just depends on the circumstance, how effective it is, what requirements it has, and the communities that you test it out in. Just because you give communities access to electricity doesn't mean they'll be able to use it. You know, communities that are sufficiently stuck in time, so to speak, probably wouldn't have much use for electricity. You would probably have to not only give them a source of electricity, but also reasons to use it. Yeah, that's getting into development economics a bit.
That's a fun place to go.
Can you ask if he's aware of Peter Turchin's work on violence in society? Structural demographic theory. I can't say that I am, but thank you for the tip. I can read about it. Maybe we can talk about it next time. Structural demographic theory. Oh, Neuro, did you hear about the submarine story from Denmark?
Nope. What happened with that?
Oh, this one's a beauty. So there's this guy who owns, and he actually built it, the largest private submarine in the world, or what had been the largest private submarine in the world. And so this guy hops in his submarine one day with a journalist. And so she's writing a piece about him for her, you know, whatever company it was. I don't remember what. And he goes off, and then he comes back. No, he doesn't come back. That's the thing. He ends up being picked up by like a fishing boat. And he tells everybody, oh yeah, my submarine sank. There was an accident. And so people said, oh, that's terrible. And what happened to the journalist? And he says, oh yeah, I dropped her off at an island. Whoa. Which is kind of weird. But okay. He dropped her off at an island, and then the submarine sank. And that became a problem pretty quickly because she never turned up. So a missing persons report, or whatever the Danish equivalent to that is, was filed, and so they started looking for her. And the police held on to the guy because they were suspicious too, because his story was getting a little weird. So she still wasn't turning up. And so eventually the guy said, oh yeah, well actually, she died in an accident, and I, quote unquote, this is what he said, buried her at sea. Which is especially suspicious. Because you'd think if somebody, and mind you, they were the only people on that submarine. So you would think if you're one of two people on a sub, and the other person dies in an accident, you would really want to bring their body back so you could say, totally an accident.
Yeah.
Even if the sub sank, you would at least make the effort. But this guy, no. No, she died in an accident on the sub, presumably before it sank, and then buried her at sea, and then the sub accidentally sank. So now the authorities are really suspicious. And their thinking is that he deliberately sank the sub after whatever happened to destroy evidence. So they're kind of putting pressure on this guy to tell the truth. And then what happens? A headless torso, woman's torso, mind you, washes up on an island near where the submarine sank. And not only does it have no head, it has no arms or legs. All of them cut off. So now the police are especially suspicious. Because obviously some shit has gone down. And so what they're thinking is he cut off this woman's head and legs after whatever happened. So nobody knows yet. In an effort to try to make it harder to identify the body. And he also mutilated the body. He tried to cut into the small intestines to release gases that would normally make a body float. That's what the Danish police say. And mind you, they've already identified this body as being the body of the female journalist that was with him. So they're pretty sure this guy did something to her at some point. Probably never know, because they were alone on the submarine. But the whole thing is just very bizarre. Yeah, there's no point to that story. I just thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's not every day that you have a submarine murderer story mystery.
Yeah. Yeah, and they've started looking at old unsolved murder cases to try to link them to see if this guy's linked to those. And one of them actually involved like a Japanese woman who disappeared and her body washed up on shore, kind of similarly mutilated.
Hmm.
Yeah, so this guy who is actually kind of well known, he's sort of this inventor guy and apparently builds private submarines. Maybe he's also a serial killer. Yeah, that'll teach you to trust people, huh?
Yeah, someone's saying, what a scary place to be with the murderer on a submarine.
Yeah, private submarine.
Well, if there's a horror movie that comes out with that as the premise, I'll remember that you told us this story.
Actually, speaking of Japanese, one of them, a couple weeks ago, I think one of the viewers who said they were from Japan, or in Japan anyway, asked me to compare Japan's state secrets law with the American equivalent, and I couldn't do it because I didn't really know that much about it. So I went back and read a bit about it. So I can actually talk a little bit about that now. Japan's state secrets law basically is a law that gives the government power to basically classify materials as quote-unquote state secrets and prevent them from entering the public sphere. Or more accurately, they can prosecute journalists or anybody else who reveals a classified quote-unquote state secret. And the criticism was that they were only doing that so that they could increase, or rather reduce, accountability in government, to try to make it easier for the government to be secretive and get away with this, that, and the other, whatever it is they want to do. Mm-hmm. But every country, most every country, certainly the United States, has equivalent such laws where they allow the government to declare certain information classified, relevant to usually national security, and to make it illegal for certain persons within the government or without to try to reveal that information publicly. So the question was, to what extent is the Japanese state secrets law a power grab as opposed to the normal implementation of a law you would see anywhere? And so from what I read, it seems like it is an overreach on the part of the Japanese government. It seems like the bill is nominally written like a normal state secrets law, but that it's deliberately vague in a lot of parts. Nominally, the law applies to national security concerns. I think specifically in my notes it says defense, diplomacy, counterterrorism, and counterespionage. But it's at the discretion of the government to define what falls under those categories. And with creative application of that reasoning, you could define almost anything to fall under that rubric. I think somebody I read was saying that they could define the Japanese nuclear energy sector and events therein as relevant to national security, and that they could declare anything relevant to that as a state secret. And the reason that's significant in the Japanese context is because of, I'm probably going to mispronounce it, the Fukushima disaster, which involved a nuclear reactor melting down. And important aspects of the government's management of that crisis and the events leading up to it and after could be termed state secrets under this law, hypothetically, if the government were to make a broad definition thereof.
To me, so it seems like it's kind of messing with the fuzzy line between someone who's betraying the government and someone who's trying to be a whistleblower and identify something bad about the government.
Yeah.
Which already in the US with stuff like Snowden and WikiLeaks, it's unclear as to whether or not these are good guys or bad guys, to the public at least.
Yeah, there is a certain amount of discretionary power on the part of the United States government as well. The difference, though, is that here in the United States, the way the law is written, it's more narrowly defined. It's more specific about information respecting national defense. And there's kind of an existing case, an existing body of law that defines what that applies to, unlike in the Japanese case. Yeah, I've got some notes here about different laws in the United States that are relevant, but That's the gist of it. The key difference is specificity and intent. Intent is the other side. In the United States, there kind of has to be established an intent on the part of the accused to deliberately harm the interests of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
That can also be broadly defined, depending on the government. But intent does play a role. I don't think anything I read about the Japanese law suggested that there was anything about intent. So even if you don't intend to share a state secret, even if you unintentionally shared one, you still could be prosecuted under the Japanese state secrets law. And that was a big criticism on the part of journalists, and a lot of journalists were critical because they said that the Japanese government did that on purpose. The idea being that journalists would be afraid to investigate sensitive areas in Japanese politics, like a Fukushima-like disaster or national security reform, because they would be afraid they might, in the process of trying just to do their job, to find information about important political issues, they might inadvertently reveal something that the government had declared a state secret and then be subject to prosecution by the law. Mm-hmm. So that creates obviously a big disincentive for the Japanese media not to do their job and to not report on things that, as stewards of Japanese democracy, they should be reporting on. So in the United States, obviously, it's much different. There are problems in the United States case, but in general, journalists are more protected and clearly don't feel particularly inclined to refrain from investigating the government in general. So that's what I read, and that's kind of the comparison there between the U.S. and Japanese state secrets law. It seems like the Japanese law is a little too vague and gives too much discretionary power to the government and doesn't do enough to allay fears on the part of Japanese media. I had something else written in my notes here that the Japanese government responded to some of the accusations and fears by saying that they would have a third party, basically within the government, look at cases where the Japanese government declared something a state secret to verify that it was not an overreach. But then the criticism of that third-party agency was that, for one, it's controlled by the same government, so there's obviously a conflict of interest there. But also that there wasn't any accountability for that third-party agency either. Nobody could really check it or see what they were doing or verify that they were actually doing their jobs.
Interesting.
So I hope that answers that person's original question. I'm sorry it took 2 weeks, but I didn't really have much to offer the first time around.
That's how it goes some of the time. You don't always know everything. But when we
Somebody asked
problem.
A narcissism problem in America? Who ever heard of such a thing?
No way.
So somebody asked for my thoughts on Austrian versus Keynesian economics. We actually talked about this before, I think before the break.
Yep.
We had a good long conversation actually about it. I don't know if I could replicate that, but basically in short, there's no Keynesian economics really. Now there's a neo-Keynesian economics, which is pretty different from the original Keynesian economics. And then Austrian economics, this is going to be a truncated version of the answer I gave before. Neo-Keynesian economics has replaced Keynesian economics, and it's much more quantitative and analytical. Austrian economics, the problem Austrian economics has always had is that it's a lot more qualitative, but as a result, it's much harder to do quantitative research. And academia and the social sciences, at least in the United States, over the past few decades has shifted very, very hard to quantitative over qualitative research, and that's made it relatively hard to do anything that would resemble purely quantitative academic research on Austrian economics. You can answer questions that are relevant to Austrian economics with quantitative research. That's probably about as close as you'd come in modern economics to Austrian research. But there's still a wide body of qualitative work, usually just books written by relevant authors, I think Alan Greenspan has written a little bit about it, but probably much more is Milton Friedman, who's kind of the standard bearer for modern Austrian economics. And then, of course, there's Schumpeter and Friedrich Hayek, whom are some of the original big authors in the field of Austrian economics. So if you're interested in them, in Austrian economics rather, those would be the people to read. And I'm sure there's no shortage of modern day bloggers and writers who fancy themselves of the Austrian school, who write quite a bit about it. So that's roughly, quick and dirty, what Austrian and Keynesian economics is, or rather, summary roughly. If you don't really know much about them, Neo-Keynesian economics is kind of more of a macroeconomic school, and it focuses more on broad economic trends, studying the economy writ large, basically, and gathering macro, national level economic data and trying to infer what different effects different parts of the economy have on overall production, GDP. So things like national investment, government spending, consumption, exports versus imports, etc. Kind of trying to break that down and find a, I'm sure my macroeconomics professor wouldn't like this wouldn't like this description because it's so simple and basic, and probably missing a lot of important details. It's been a number of years since I've studied macroeconomics and Neo-Keynesian economics. But basically, the goal in the models that I was taught back in the day were focused on finding an optimal steady-state equilibrium, an optimal rate of growth that would be sustained over time, that would be reached by modifying and changing different input variables. So it's a very sort of mechanical, quantitative approach to studying a national economy. Austrian economics, in contrast, focuses a lot more on kind of a qualitative, almost conversational explanation of how economies work and how they thrive. And they generally fall along the line of saying that governments should be smaller, economies should be less regulated, and people should be allowed to be free economic actors, basically, with minimal interference. And that those are the optimal conditions in which economies work. And of course, I'm sure there's a lot of nuance to the school of thought that I'm missing there, but without getting into it too deeply, that's roughly what it is. So, rough definitions of what they are, and then quick summary of my thoughts on them. I don't really have personally, I don't have a firm belief either way. I don't invest much in any particular school of thought, especially since they're not really philosophies so much as they are technical now in economics. I'm just for whatever works, personally. Whatever people will accept.
I'm for
a lot of people
wins.
Some people were asking for a link, apparently, about the submarine killer dude.
Mm-hmm.
You can just Google it. You can just, because I've been reading about it on BBC World News. So I'm sure you could just Google BBC World News, Denmark submarine serial murderer. I'm sure it'll be one of the top returns. What do you think about the second Japanese merchant ship to wreck with a U.S. Navy ship? Yeah, that, I think I read that was the 4th accident the U.S. Navy had inside the past year. And I think the Navy even stopped, or what was it, froze Navy operations for a period of time while they did a review to try to figure out what was going on there. From what I read, because they're still doing the review, but from what I read, some early analysis suggests it might just be operational tempo. The U.S. Navy, as big as it is, has a global role, and generally it centers around high traffic areas of world shipping routes. So between sort of haggard crews, we're just tired from working quite a bit, as you do in the Navy, and maybe training not being what it should be, and also operating in high traffic areas. All of those factors may have combined to produce a rise in accidents. I don't know how much of that couldn't have been said for previous years, though, so I don't know why this year in particular seems to have so many. So yeah, I couldn't, pending the end of the review and maybe further analysis on the part of other people, on the part of more knowledgeable analysts than me, that's about all I can give. You know, sometimes it's just stupid shit. You know, people in the even most powerful militaries will make mistakes. I remember a story from a number of years ago about, what was it? It was an American submarine, and they had a journalist on board. The story ends a little bit differently than the other submarine story. It was an American submarine, they had a journalist on board, and they asked her if she wanted to pilot the submarine in a, I don't remember what the maneuver it's called, but it's basically when the submarine ascends very quickly and basically leaps out of the water, out of the surface, and then lands. It's kind of a rapid escalation type maneuver. It's not something you would normally do in a submarine, but I guess they wanted to just impress her or something. So they let her take the controls and do that, and oh shit, when they break the surface, they break right through the underside of a Japanese fishing vessel. And break the sucker in half. Yeah, whoops. That was a big whoops. So that killed a number of people, and then there was a bunch of charges and whatnot brought against the guy who, the captain of the submarine, for allowing that to happen. It was not terribly responsible. So, yeah, that stupid shit does happen.
Sometimes bad things happen to stupid people.
Then the next question was, have you read The Shock Doctrine, and do you have thoughts, opinions? I have not read Shock Doctrine. I think that's the Naomi, what's her name? Naomi, it's not Naomi Campbell, is it? That's an actress. Yeah, I think I know the book they're referring to, though. I have not read it. From what I understand about it, I have read a few articles referring to the book and some book reviews. Yeah, I mean, to a degree, the government does manipulate the public like that, you know, in the manner she describes, which is basically to use disasters and whatnot to push people to certain points of view, to support government policies that are what you would consider neoliberal.
Naomi Klein.
There you go, Naomi Klein. Yeah, that's kind of something politicians in the U.S. learned after World War II, if not during World War II, which is that if you want the U.S. public to do something, especially if it has to do with foreign policy, sending American troops overseas to fight in other places, what they found was that the best way to do that was just to scare the hell out of the public. Basically just hype threats as much as possible, make them seem as scary and dangerous as possible. And so they've kind of, that's a trick, a technique, so to speak, that's been used by American political elites ever since. It's pretty effective, since normally Americans, you know, I think we've said it before, most Americans don't really care about what happens overseas that much. And so if you want to sell anything that has to do with operating overseas, you generally have to sell it pretty hard. Yeah, in lieu of really reading the book, I can't really comment too much on it. I would have to look into it more deeply. But I'm a little skeptical of anybody who kind of claims that all of the government is just part of a big conspiracy that tries to push certain policies or has some mega effective technique for influencing people.
No one's that organized at such a large scale.
Yeah, in general, you know, if there is some global conspiracy to influence world events, they're not very good at their jobs.
Haphazard at best.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thanking Kessnuts there. So did you see that the Trump administration released a new Afghan plan?
I saw that he made a speech about Afghanistan, but I don't know what the plan is. What is the plan?
Basically doing more of the same. There's
wow.
not really a, there's not really a substantive difference from previous policy. So some good points about the plan. There's no time limit now. The Obama administration said that he would send more troops, but they would only be there for a certain period of time. So if you're the Taliban, then you can just kind of ride that out.
Mm-hmm.
No big problem for them. So the new plan doesn't have any time frame. It's just there to win, so to speak. So that's an improvement in that sense. Also, he paid more attention to Pakistan and the role they play in the war and supporting rebel groups in Afghanistan. That's a big improvement.
Obama paid more attention to Pakistan?
Sorry, what?
Obama paid more attention to Pakistan, or Trump did?
Trump did, with his new plan.
I see.
So that's a big improvement. And I think we've talked a bit about that before, how important Pakistan is to the conflict's outcome,
yeah,
whatever it may be. But in terms of any change in strategy, there's an increase in troops, but it's not really that big, and it doesn't seem like there's any change in strategy. It just seems that they're going to, Donald Trump himself says they'll focus more on killing terrorists rather than nation building, but that's not going to change anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, what's his name? Matisse. He's basically one of his national security advisors. I think he's the defense secretary, if I'm remembering correctly. He came out and released some statements saying that the United States may not win with this strategy, but neither would the Taliban. So it would behoove the Taliban to reach some kind of deal, to negotiate.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's going to work. And so one of the flaws with the plan is the same flaw that pretty much every American plan in Afghanistan has had, which is that the Taliban, and specifically rebel groups in general, because not every rebel group in Afghanistan is the Taliban, rebel groups in Afghanistan know that they can outlast the United States. Because already there's a fair amount of disinterest in the war in Afghanistan. I think a lot of people barely remember there's a war in Afghanistan half the time.
Yeah.
But in contrast, the rebel groups in Afghanistan, they live there. They are Afghans, for the most part anyway. And so, they know that if they just keep fighting, then eventually the United States will get exhausted and disinterested and will probably leave in a substantive way. So that's an innate advantage they have, and it's not addressed in this new plan. There's no sense of urgency or sense of trying to wrap the war up in a compelling way. There's no sense of an end game with this new plan. And anything that doesn't have any clear goals or criteria thereof has an innate problem in that it's a mission without an endpoint.
So is it more of just him expanding his narrative? If it's nothing different than what we've already been doing, aside from removing a date.
Well, he's always said that he's going to be tougher on terrorism and that he's the tougher leader, better on national security, etc. So, yeah, partly that's just bolstering his narrative that he's had for, since he started running for president. He had people in his administration, usually people of the, Bannon clique, so to speak, who were saying the United States should just leave, that it wasn't really worth the effort to stay in Afghanistan. But those people are increasingly marginalized within the administration. And a lot of the people who have actual military experience don't want to leave Afghanistan because, if the United States did pull out substantively, then it could turn into a safe haven for, sundry terrorist groups, what have you. Now, personally, I don't know if that's a really great reason to keep fighting a forever war, because for one, there are plenty of other safe havens outside of Afghanistan for terrorist groups. So there's nothing special about Afghanistan in that regard.
Yeah, well, it also kind of brings back that issue of the norms there need to change. If they want to have a democratic nation like ours with really strong civil institutions where it's secular governance and all this, then that's something that has to happen within the people there. We can't wrestle them into democracy.
Yeah, that's very accurate. If the people in Afghanistan don't necessarily fight the Taliban because they love democracy, they generally fight because they have personal interest in doing so. Some of them fight just because they're in the government. You know, they fight for the government because they joined the army because they needed a job, and so then they fight naturally. Other people are just bandits who get hired out by somebody to fight them. Other people are locals who don't want the Taliban hoarding in on their business because growing opium is very lucrative, and there are lots of warlords who benefit from it just as much as the Taliban. You know, the conflict in Afghanistan is very fluid. It's not binary. It's not like it's pro-Western Afghans versus anti-Western Taliban. You know, there are a lot of parties involved on both sides. I mean, and they go back and forth. One of the most interesting things I read about conflict there talked about localized bandit groups, basically. You know, localized warlords or bandit groups, whom will pretty regularly switch sides depending on who's more powerful in their area. You know, they may start fighting for the Taliban just because they're powerful there, and so they can have a free hand in operating. But then if the government gets powerful, or if the government offers them a better deal, they'll switch over and join the local police force, or join the army, or fight on their behalf, until later on, when the government maybe gets kicked out by the Taliban or something, and then they'll switch sides again.
So there's not really the best option for them.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, the warlords obviously are not terribly interested in democracy so much as they are in bolstering their own power. And the politics therein fall more along the lines of exploiting foreign aid, which gets used in patronage networks a lot, as well as just protecting local fiefdoms. So warlords in that sense tolerate the government in so much as it gives them a free hand to operate and helps them with fighting the Taliban. But beyond that, there's no greater loyalty, so to speak, to any higher ideal like democracy or helping the people in their area, beyond any more what they have to stay there. So the conflict in that sense is just very dynamic. It has a lot of different actors involved fighting for a lot of different reasons. But rather than really kind of addressing that with a deeper analysis and a better overarching plan, the US government doesn't do that. It kind of colors the conflict in very much in ideological terms. But in order for a conflict to be ideological, generally the people and the country has to be relatively modern. Because nationalism is not something that comes naturally to people. You know, Europe did not have nationalism until the late 1700s and 1800s. And even then, it didn't always stick. So in a case like Afghanistan, where people live, you know, not feudal lives, but relatively backwards, relatively agricultural, not urban, and, you know, living kind of much as they have for the past few centuries, the argument that they should stand up and fight for their country, such as it is, doesn't pull as much weight as it would in, say, France, which has a very strong centralized national identity. And it doesn't help that the traditional Afghan view of the government is that it's kind of far away. You know, most Afghans will probably tell you that they're patriots, that they do like Afghanistan, etc., as the mother country. But their view of the government is that it shouldn't tell them what to do and that it should stay out of their business and that it's kind of its own thing. You know, there's a reason that the Prime Minister of Afghanistan is, well, maybe actually it's President. The President of Afghanistan is joked as, the joke is that he's the mayor of Kabul, because that's about as far as his power extends. And that's not a very powerful place in Afghanistan either, because most of the population lives in rural areas still. It's not a predominantly urban society. So even if you get into urban areas and you control those, you're still not really controlling most of the population.
Well, the whole bandit lifestyle is basically one of the most traditional professions you can have.
Oh yeah.
That's how little tribes were set up. Basically, if you can ransack the neighboring tribe, then you do, and you take all their stuff. And that's kind of survival. So the idea of nationalism being the traditional thing is more a product of us forgetting the state of nature rather than that they have different traditions. Europeans have the same tradition if you go back far enough. It's just a matter of kind of where the norms are right now.
Yeah, and there's no clear answer as to how do you get from point A to point B. How do you transform a society like that? You know, the Trump administration says it's not interested in nation building, so it may be that the United States has just given up on transforming Afghanistan in that manner, to try to create a strong national identity that would give the government more legitimacy and give people more impetus to resist the Taliban. Some other interesting trivia about the nature of the conflict and how it's multifaceted. A lot of families in rural areas will have, because they have large families frequently, a lot of them will have one son fight for the government and one son fight for the Taliban so that they can have influence with both, just in case.
Yeah. You gotta diversify your offspring.
Yeah. You know, if you're a small farmer, you know, small-time farmer in a village somewhere in rural Afghanistan, the government probably doesn't have a lot of impact on your life. You know, it has the potential to do good, but you probably don't put much faith in it, especially given the nature of Afghan history over the past few decades. And the Taliban, on the other hand, you probably don't particularly like, because they extract taxes and can be violent shitheads too. You know, see the previous comment about bandits fighting for the Taliban. So they're not much loved either, but, you know, they do at least provide some semblance of law and order. And they even have their own court system in the areas they control. So if, you know, if you're a small-time farmer in a small village, it kind of behooves you to play both sides and to be careful with, you know, which side you shack up with. You don't want to get too close with any one side, because then the other will kill you. You know, the government, for example, made a lot of enemies by going out and burning opium, or not opium, but poppy fields. Farmers would grow poppy because that's, you know, you can make a lot of money growing that, relatively anyway, compared to other things. And the government knew that the Taliban were taxing that, because the farmers wouldn't really report it when they were paying taxes, because it's illegal to grow poppy. But the Taliban would tacitly allow it so that they could tax it and make money off it. The government knew that, so they went in and burned the fields. But then, of course, that destroyed the livelihoods of a lot of farmers and turned them against the government. And more to the point, their need for cash was such that they would end up taking whatever job they could get, and frequently that would be taking a job fighting with the Taliban. So that was a self-defeating move on the part of the government there. And it's an example of how mercenary a lot of political actors are in the conflict. Anyway, one of the things that could be done is to focus on Pakistan, and that was, you know, one of the good things about the plan. Pakistan does support a lot of rebel groups. Specifically, it supports the Taliban and the Haqqani network, the two major remaining rebel groups in Afghanistan. And if more pressure could be brought on the Pakistanis, specifically the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, the ISI, if they could be brought to reduce the level of their support and to put pressure on those rebel groups to reach a peace deal, that could bring it into the conflict. But I think we've talked a bit before about why Pakistan doesn't want to do that, and why they think they have a strong interest in maintaining those rebel groups there as their proxies, and having a de facto veto over Afghan policy, specifically foreign policy, which they don't want to be very friendly to India, because they're afraid if Afghanistan becomes an Indian ally, they face the prospect of a two-front war, west and east, in the event of a conflict with India. So for them, from their perspective, maintaining strong influence over Afghanistan through rebel groups is in their national security interest. And nations, once they deem something to be in their nation's national security interest, can be a bit stubborn about moving on such points, as evidenced by the United States. We do plenty of that too. So the Trump administration kind of recognized that problem, and they've talked about, basically he flirted with India a bit in terms of having some kind of strategic understanding in terms of pressuring Pakistan to do more in Afghanistan to alleviate the fighting and maybe start on the road to peace. But the way he talked about it was kind of vague. It seemed like he hadn't really invested much into it. It was more just thoughts and hints here and there, rather than any kind of coherent plan, or offer for that matter. And without more of a concrete threat, basically, a credible strategic threat against Pakistan with regard to their support for rebel groups, I don't think the Pakistanis will shift gears, so to speak. And even if you did, there's a problem there too, which is that even if the United States just formally allied with India and declared that if Pakistan didn't change its ways with respect to the Taliban and the Haqqani network, that it would, formally pose some kind of security threat to the Pakistanis, maybe in terms of supporting separatists in Pakistan, because they have plenty of those. usually Pashtun and Balochi. Even if that explicit threat were made, then that might just drive the Pakistanis to the Chinese. Pakistan actually has a long-running strategic alliance with China that goes back a number of decades. And right now, they're kind of allies of both the United States and China. But if the United States were to decisively break with Pakistan, the Pakistanis would just double down with China. So they wouldn't necessarily have to change. In that sense, putting pressure, you would almost have to go to China at that point and ask them to put pressure on Pakistan to change. And it's debatable the degree to which the Chinese government would be interested in such an arrangement. And then, of course, Pakistan has nuclear weapons. The United States can't really threaten them too much. And it's not even just the threat that they would retaliate with nuclear weapons. Even if you succeeded in somehow dismantling or destabilizing the Pakistani government, there's the threat that the nukes would be lost, basically, that they would fall into the wrong hands, quote unquote. So in that sense, that's a problem that's posed by the prospect of economic sanctions. If you bring economic pressure to bear on Pakistan to reduce support for rebels in Afghanistan, there's the possibility the government and economy become so destabilized that the country just kind of implodes. And then you're back to the loose nukes problem. So even that option has risk to it. And then from what I read, India has a limited capacity to help. India has some presence in Afghanistan, but there's not a whole lot more they can do than what they're doing now, which is mostly giving some supplies, military aid and supplies, and then also a training mission, from what I read.
So I'm pulling up the map here of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, just so people can kind of see that relationship geographically. So you have Afghanistan up kind of northwest, Pakistan wedged between India and Afghanistan, and then you have Jammu and Kashmir and Punjab. So it's this contested territory in the north side of Pakistan, between India and Pakistan. Who has it? Whose is it? They'll never admit.
Oh, Kashmir there?
Mm-hmm.
You see the dotted line there?
Yeah.
That's the line of control. So everything west and north of that line is Pakistani, and everything east and south is Indian.
Hmm.
That's basically where the front line was when the war ended in 1948, I want to say. Just fought over control of Kashmir between Pakistan and India.
So how does India have a presence in Afghanistan? Because I see, based on that contested territory, there's potentially a part of what could be India that's touching Afghanistan, but aside from that...
Oh no, that sliver right there is actually Chinese occupied.
Oh.
Yeah, the Chinese, yeah, there's also another big chunk, a big circle that's kind of cut off from the west.
Yep.
That's also occupied by China. And China took both those bits of territory in a border war with India in the 1960s. I think we talked a little bit about that before. When we were talking before, though, I think we were talking more about the eastern area around the Chicken Neck, around Bangladesh. Yeah, the other part of that border war was fought over here around Kashmir, and the Chinese bit off a big chunk of Indian-occupied Kashmir doing that. So India doesn't have any direct connection to Afghanistan. In that sense, there's not a lot they could do. But they do have a training mission. They can fly in, special forces advisors or what have you, and have them interact with the Afghan military. And of course, they can send supplies and whatnot, mostly, by air or, by rail, or however else they can find to get into whatever other method they can find to get in Afghanistan.
So why did China take a chunk out of India? What was the motivation for that?
They'd always claimed the territory. That the specific bits of territory in Kashmir they took, they'd always claimed. And, kind of for the same logic and reasoning, they wanted to kind of get up to the mountain, so to speak. The territory they took was a bit east of a mountain range. And so the Indians controlled some flat territory to the east of what would otherwise be a mountain border. And the Chinese just swooped in and basically pushed the border up to the mountain range.
Yeah,
that's roughly what it was.
Okay, kind of an argument from geography of this is a natural division point. Why don't we just take everything that's on the other side.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it was the exact reason that the Indians have been trying so hard to prevent the Chinese from having a foothold on the other side of the Himalayan mountains, on the southern side. They don't want them to have easy access to flat terrain where it would be easier to fight. Better to keep them on the other side of the mountain. So, just the flip side of that, basically. The Chinese wanted to push the Indians out of the other side of to the other side of the Himalayan mountains there, or whatever mountain range that is. I don't know if it's the same mountain range.
And I would guess that fitting with the theme of disputed territory like this, it's probably kind of desolate and kind of low population.
Yeah, I don't think there's hardly any people there.
Yeah.
You could say that for most of Kashmir, probably. Yeah, most of the people who live in Kashmir actually live kind of in the southwestern part. There's kind of this strip of relatively flat territory that's arable, or you can actually grow crops and whatnot.
I interrupted you though. You're saying special forces advisors dropped into Afghanistan and what?
Oh well, I mean that and supplies. Those were the two main ways that India interacts with Afghanistan at a strategic level. But I was saying that there's not much more they can do. That's kind of the upper limit. You know, the Indian military doesn't have like a really high capacity. You know, they're kind of at their tipping point, kind of at their maximum there in terms of their ability to project power. Anything more, and they would need a significantly larger budget, and the Indian government just doesn't have the money for that. So in that sense, bringing in India to try to pressure Pakistan on Afghanistan is not entirely workable, because the Indians themselves are limited in their capacity to project that force that would be necessary to do that. And doing so only really pushes Pakistan further into China's grip. Well, not grip, but alliance, rather. And at that point, you would have to engage really with the Chinese more than the Indians. I think if the Trump administration really wanted to try to make a good plan, they would have to be much more explicit about, this is kind of what I already said, more explicit about working with India, and maybe expanding capacity on the part of India, and also threaten severe economic sanctions. Right now, there's not really any talk about any kind of sanctions economically against Pakistan, but if they really wanted to change their behavior, that's pretty much the direction you would have to go. Talking with China, that would be the other big thing, since Pakistan kind of leans on China as a counterpoint to U.S. influence. If nothing else, you could just leave Afghanistan outright and just leave it to Pakistan and let them handle it. And then just make it explicit as you do so that if there were any further terrorist activity emanating from Afghanistan, that Pakistan would be held responsible instead of Afghanistan. You know, if that threat were made explicit, it might be more likely that they would actually change. Because then they get what they want. They get their quote-unquote strategic depth, as they call it. They would get Afghanistan. But in turn, the United States would get something that it wanted, which is to prevent terrorist groups from operating there.
I think it's interesting from the 21st century perspective, especially just my intuition. I think of India as being a very non-violent, non-military type of country. But if you go back historically, there was so many wars and legendary heroes and all this conflict and stuff. And we kind of think of the British imperialism when we think of India, where it's like, oh yeah, they kind of just roll over, they don't really do too much, they're just nice Hindus over there. But with the size of their economy, I would guess that at this point they have a very sizable kind of military influence in the region, just by kind of the force that they can project if they wanted to.
Yeah, India is the 800-pound gorilla in South Asia, for sure. And one of the reasons that Pakistan's military is so much more powerful relative to other institutions there is the fear of India, which stems a little bit from the debate that happened before India and Pakistan became independent in British India about what independent India would look like. You know, the communal violence and later on partition kind of fed paranoia and mistrust between the two sides. And that helped feed a lot of paranoia in the Pakistani military about the national security and integrity of Pakistan. The fear being that India might try to reunify with Pakistan forcibly at some point, or would otherwise try to undermine Pakistan to make it as unsuccessful as possible. That line of logic had a fair amount of currency in post-independence Pakistan, and the Pakistani military was able to leverage that into a significant amount of military and political power. Yeah, India can be surprisingly nasty when it wants to be. I think we talked a little bit about last time about princely states in British India, and how they were territories in British India that were not directly controlled by the British government. They were actually controlled by Indian kings and royal families, and they had basically British advisors, quote unquote, that kind of directed their rule to try to make sure they didn't defer too much from the British imperial line. The big question before independence was what happens to those princely states. Do they become independent? Do they join India? Do they join Pakistan? What do you do with them? And so we talked about that last time in terms of, in the context of Kashmir, which was one of those princely states. But there was another large princely state called the Nizam of Hyderabad. I don't think we talked about it last time. And the Nizam of Hyderabad was, well, the territory anyway, was a large chunk of central India on the Deccan Plateau. I think that's how it's pronounced anyway. And the vast majority of the population there was Hindu. But the leader of Hyderabad was Muslim. And he wanted to join Pakistan. That was his preference. But that wasn't really acceptable to the Hindu population in Hyderabad. And it wasn't even really acceptable to the Indian government, for that matter. So what happened after the Nizam is the basically king of Hyderabad at that time. So basically, when the king of Hyderabad announced his decision, there was an immense amount of unrest. And there were these Muslim militiamen called, I think they were called Razakers. Probably a mispronunciation too. But anyway, these Muslim militiamen cracked down on the anti-government protesters who didn't want to join Pakistan. They wanted Hyderabad to be in India. And when he did, there was basically a significant amount of civil conflict between the bulk of the population, which wanted into India, and the nominal government, which wanted into Pakistan. And the result was that the Indian government cited that as justification for an intervention, humanitarian intervention, of course, which they staged and then subsequently annexed Hyderabad into India, according to the wishes, as they said, of the majority of the population. But of course, that went against the spirit of the original agreement, which was to let princely states make their own decision. And the Indian government didn't particularly care for that, because the prospect of having a chunk of Pakistan within Indian territory, because it would have been entirely surrounded by India, by the rest of India. It wouldn't have had any contiguous connection with West Pakistan or East Pakistan. They had no desire to have that strategic liability right in the heartland of India. So they were quite happy to take the opportunity to launch their quote-unquote humanitarian intervention. Yeah, they actually did the same thing to East Pakistan, or Bangladesh, in 1971, when the Pakistani, we talked about, I think, a bit about this before too. The Bangladeshis basically started protesting against what they thought was discrimination by the Pakistani government. And so the Indian government, once the Pakistani military started cracking down and killing a lot of people, the Indian government took that as an opportunity to stage another quote-unquote humanitarian operation and to kick the Pakistani military out of Bangladesh and give it independence. Mm-hmm. So the Indian government can exhibit a fair amount of realpolitik when it feels like it, and it has more than enough power to exercise that. Not really anymore, since Pakistan developed nuclear weapons, because now there's kind of a balance of terror. Nobody really wants to mess with that. And that, of course, is the big advantage with having nuclear weapons. It's a
mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, mutually assured destruction. It's a great deterrent tool. And of course, with Pakistan, which has this weird complex with regard to India, this giant country on its border that it thinks is out to get them, nuclear weapons were a must for them in the context of the regional rivalry. Let's see, there's a question here. are territorial disputes between nations in the Middle East primarily due to political interests or natural resources? Territorial disputes. I don't think that they're really due to natural resources. I think they are mostly political. Because a lot of the territorial disputes, and not political disputes, but territorial disputes, a lot of those are mostly either sectarian or overtly political. The Kurds, for example, won independence in northern Iraq. That's not really resources, although they do have a fair amount of oil. But, you know, the Kurds in western Iran and southeastern Turkey don't have any oil, but they're just as adamant about it. There was an island dispute between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, which was finally settled when the Egyptian government under al-Sisi, the present president, offered to hand over basically 2 of the disputed islands to Saudi Arabia scot-free. And that upset Egyptian nationalists a great deal, because no nationalist likes to give up territory.
He just did it to improve relations?
Yeah, pretty much, because Egypt, I mean, it's disputable, because the Egyptian government says they were only holding the islands for Saudi Arabia.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah, because they'd occupied them originally, I think, in the 1960s, when relations were pretty bad between the Saudis and Egyptians. And they said that they'd always been Egyptian and they were going to keep them. But then when they handed them back, they said, oh no, we were just holding them for the Saudis, now we're giving them back. That's the logic anyway. But here's the thing, after the Muslim Brotherhood was kicked out of power, in that military coup that the US government doesn't want to call a military coup, after that happened, the Egyptian government really needed help with their economy, which has not been doing great for the past 15-some years. And the United States was not really gung-ho about helping out the coup/not-coup government in Egypt at that time, because it didn't really trust them to maintain legitimacy. The United States government doesn't really want to pick a side, but it also definitely doesn't want to pick the losing side. And there's a suspicion that al-Sisi and the military government right now might not be able to hold on to power for the long term. And that doesn't really make it conducive to American interests to be seen to be too close to him. So in lieu of American foreign aid, which was needed again to shore up the Egyptian economy, especially government subsidies to food, which are very popular in Egypt, as you can imagine, instead they turned to the Saudis, who were happy to jump in and help out the enemies of the Muslim Brotherhood, which they hated, and consider a threat not only to the Saudi regime, but to regional security in general. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend, basically. They saw the Egyptian government as a useful proxy, so to speak, to use against the Muslim Brotherhood to make sure they didn't end up with a power base in Egypt. And the Saudis then jumped in and gave a whole shit ton of economic aid to Egypt to help them out. So the island handover, you could argue, there's no definitive proof yet, but you could argue was kind of a part of that. That was part of the Egyptian government trying to give the Saudis something in return to kind of pay them back. That's not exactly a great return for the Saudis. It's not like there's anybody living on the island. They're basically just 2 desert islands in the middle of nowhere. But, again, nationalists hate to lose territory but love to gain it. You know, so the ire of Egypt's nationalists was the great love of Saudi nationalists. Not sure how we got onto Egyptian islands, but... Oh, right, the territorial disputes. Yeah, so territorial disputes, they're not that meaningful in the Middle East generally. It's almost always principally political, above and beyond any natural resources that are there. Natural resources can exacerbate it. You know, the Iraqi government is especially not inclined to give the Kurds in northern Iraq independence, or even a substantial amount of autonomy, because of the oil there. You know, the Iraqi government wants that oil revenue. You know, the only reason the Kurds right now in northern Iraq have any autonomy is just because of weakness on the part of the Iraqi government, rather than a lack of desire by the Iraqi government to control that territory. You know, if the Iraqi government had more powerful military and more political support, they would probably move in hard on northern Iraq and try to You know, maybe even just seize outright control of the oil fields there. Oh God, somebody asked about the Balkans. Why is America's policy in the Balkans pro-Muslim?
Is it?
Well, here's the thing. I don't know that the United States has a Balkans policy. Right now, I think, I mean, well, especially under the Trump administration, which doesn't have a lot of, is kind of rudderless in terms of foreign policy. You know, but even if you consider past administrations, there hasn't been a lot of policy in terms of what to do about the Balkans. I don't think there's a lot of interest on the part of Washington, and what interest there is pretty mild and not really backed up with significant resources. So I don't know if I would venture so far as to say it's pro-Muslim, if only because saying it's pro-Muslim suggests there's a policy at all. In so much as there is one, I guess you could call it pro-Muslim in the sense that it's relatively pro-Albanian. It's certainly backed, what was it, Kosovo, the breakaway province from Serbia. That's an ethnically Albanian province. Certainly the United States and Europe have backed that to the hilt. But I don't think that's pro-Muslim per se. I think that was more of a stability thing. And, you know, again, that was mostly Europeans, not so much the United States. The United States really had to be dragged into peacekeeping in Yugoslavia in the Civil War there in the early 90s. And after that, the Europeans kind of had to again coax the United States into doing something in Serbia. You know, again, the United States government doesn't have a great interest there, but the Europeans do. But the Europeans don't have a whole lot of capacity to enact their political preferences in the Balkans. So when it comes to peacekeeping and military operations, they generally fall back on the United States military. Yeah, that was largely just a peacekeeping thing. The Serbs, you know, fairly or unfairly, I'm sure the Serbs would argue unfairly, were painted as basically being genocidal maniacs in Kosovo. And in order to preserve peace in the world, well, achieve peace in the region, rather, a peacekeeping mission into Kosovo was deemed necessary, and so troops were deployed. And that stopped the conflict, although it hasn't really stopped the dispute. Serbia has never recognized the independence of Kosovo and still claims that it's an integral part of Serbia. You know, the dispute about Albanians and Kosovo between ethnic Serbs and Albanians there kind of goes back to the 80s. It didn't used to be ethnically Albanian. It actually used to be mostly Serb. And the Serbs actually consider it the heartland of their people, historically speaking. And so over time, though, the ethnic composition changed to be more Albanian, partly because of policies by the Tito government in communist Yugoslavia. But even though the ethnic composition changed, Serbs still consider it sort of an integral part of their country because of its historical role, you know, its historical significance to Serb history. And as a result, they didn't really take well when some of the Albanians in Kosovo started to rebel. And the result was a very, very nasty conflict that ended up with being ended by European peacekeepers with American support. I don't know if I would call, again, I don't think that's really pro-Muslim or not, but certainly it would seem to be for the perspective of someone on the ground, so I can understand that. Yeah, I know I don't always pronounce Muslim right.
I think the way that you pronounce it is correct. So the Americanized pronunciation is Muslim, but the Arabic pronunciation, I think, in the global one is Muslim. So the way that you're saying it is correct in more places than it's incorrect.
Yeah, Muslim, I think, is the Arabic pronunciation.
Yeah.
And then in English, I think it's supposed to be Muslim. I think PacFact looked that up. And then sometimes, because I'm scatterbrained, I mix them up and then say Muslim. Which I'm sure, I think some people were laughing about that in the chat earlier. Would India really get that much out of occupying/annexing Pakistan? Definitely not. Because the first thing that would happen would be basically an eternal insurgency. The people would just rebel because, Pakistan, whether you think it should exist or not, certainly the people in Pakistan think so, and they would not take well to Indian occupation. Yeah, that goes back to the whole argument from before independence, before India and Pakistan became independence, about whether or not Muslims in India needed their own state. Because there were a number of debates about whether this, that, or the other group should have their own independent state, or whether all of British India should just become independent as a whole, one independent India. And the Muslims under the Muslim League, led by a guy named Jinnah, they argued that they were a separate culture, a separate civilization, and that they should have their own homeland. And from what I was reading, there was some dispute about whether or not Jinnah actually really wanted an independent Pakistan, or if he was just using it as a negotiating tactic to try to get more representation in India's parliament. And the idea was that the Muslims in a united India would be a minority, and so in order to protect them and their status as a minority, to prevent oppression, so to speak, from the majority Hindus, their desire, the Muslim League's desire, was to have a system whereby there would be a certain number of seats in parliament that would be reserved only for Muslim politicians, representatives of the Muslim community. And something like that, I think, was already agreed to for the Dalits, the bottom rung, so to speak, of the caste system in India. They ended up with a kind of reservation system in parliament for them, I believe, if I'm remembering that correctly. And that was a condition of support for the leading Dalit representative in negotiations, a guy named Ambedkar, I think was his name. So the Muslim League wanted something like that, but there was a lot of suspicion and distrust of the Muslim League on the part of the Indian National Congress, which thought they were trying to get more power than they should have, basically disproportionate representation in India's government. And there was a broader problem too, which was a difference in philosophies. Neuro, who's a major leader in the Indian National Congress, wanted a strong central government for independent India. And Jinnah wanted the opposite. He wanted a weaker, decentralized central government and much stronger state governments. And the reason he wanted that was that he was afraid of a strong central government because he was afraid it would be dominated by Hindus who might oppress the Muslim minority. So for him, the solution then was just have a weak, decentralized government. The Indian National Congress was very opposed to that, and I think part of the reason was that they were afraid that regional differences in India would be extenuated by strong state governments, and that it would lead eventually to the breakup of India if there was not a strong central force, combining the country together. So I think there was a fear on the part of Nehru and the INC that over the long term, India may not be able to maintain its integrity without a strong central government. Territorial integrity, rather. Jinnah was skeptical of that argument, and so eventually that's part of what led to the divide between them. I was also reading there was a lot of personality differences between them. They didn't get along with each other, apparently. And then, of course, all of it was exacerbated by the fact that Britain wanted to get out of India really quickly. They basically said in 1946, all right, we're going to leave in a year. And so then there was only about a year to really get into the details of what independent India was like. So the decision ended up getting rushed. And the result is kind of what we have today, which is a rather poorly planned partition of India into Pakistan and modern India. And the perpetual conflict resulting from the ambiguity about the fate of princely states. Yeah, princely states didn't make out very well. Generally, they ended up getting pushed around by the Indian or Pakistani government. And I don't think any of the royal families ended up being able to retain their power. Both India and Pakistan took the princely states they'd absorbed into their territory and stripped the royal families of power and handed those territories over to the control of democratic institutions that were representative of the populations rather than of the whims of some royal family. At least most of them didn't get invaded like Hyderabad did. On a related note, can you go over the history of control over the Suez Canal? I haven't studied that too much, so I can't really say too much about it. I think I know anyway, that the Suez Canal was originally funded by the French. They started that project in the, I want to say 1860s, 1870s, something around there. And they finished it maybe 10, 20 years later. And it's kind of a tricky history to work out, because Egypt was never properly colonized, per se. It's not as though it was, occupied, invaded and occupied like other parts of Africa were. Rather, the Egyptian government was nominally independent, but was heavily subject to influence by major European powers, whom forced the Egyptian government to give concessions in terms of the judiciary and in terms of customs duties and in terms of economic regulations. Not economic, well, in terms of how the economy was managed. In that sense, a lot of things that would normally be controlled by the sovereign Egyptian government had to be handed over to other entities, basically, controlled by Europeans instead. So the judiciary ended up being heavily influenced by Europeans and partly manned by Europeans. Same with major investors. A lot of investment projects in Egypt that had been subject to control or influence by the Egyptian government were handed over to European investors or European countries. So colonialism in Egypt was a little bit different than in other places. Like Algeria was just outright controlled by France, basically annexed by France. Egypt wasn't quite that direct. So the Suez Canal was not necessarily controlled per se by foreign powers, but France paid for it and declared kind of a special interest in it. So effectively, the French controlled it. And then the British, in turn, moved in eventually and became the dominant imperial power in Egypt, I think in the late 19th century, early 20th century, something around there. And at that point, they became the dominant shareholder, so to speak, in the Suez Canal project. And from that point on, they were pretty much the owners of it, de facto, again, not de jure, up until, I want to say, the 1950s. And at that point, there was a very pro-Western Egyptian monarch that had ruled Egypt for basically most of the 20th century. And he was kind of the conduit through which Europeans were able to exert a lot of their power in Egypt. He was thrown out by pan-Arab nationalists led by General Nasser, who was a famous figure in Egypt's history as well as Middle Eastern history, because he inspired a lot of similar activity, a lot of similar pan-Arab nationalist revolts and etc. in the region. When he took power, one of his big goals, an object of national pride, was the nationalization of the Suez Canal. So it would be owned by foreign shareholders, explicitly the British government, to a lesser degree the French government. And he just wanted to make it purely owned and operated by the Egyptian government. And technically, it's the sovereign right of a country to do that. It's not particularly legal in international legal terms, but being their sovereign territory, he could do that. So he did, and basically single-handedly kicked the British and French out of Egypt, which was very obvious. It was not received well in Europe, suffice it to say, such that the Egyptian and French governments got together with the Israeli government and hatched a conspiracy, which was basically to invade Egypt and seize the Suez Canal by force. And that was the famous Suez Canal crisis in 1956, I think it was. And they were largely successful, but the Soviet Union and the United States, neither of which particularly liked European empires, both put pressure on them to pull out and to leave Egypt alone, basically. And because Western Europe and Israel were so, well, less so Israel at that time, but because Britain and France were so dependent on American military protection and especially economic aid, because this was not that long after the end of World War II, because of that dependency, they agreed to leave. And so that was kind of the last hurrah for European empire. So that's a really quick and dirty history of who controls the Suez Canal that probably misses a lot of details, because I don't know a whole lot about that. What
Agent
do you
Smith
think?
is a very humble person. Most people would be like, Suez Canal, someone made a canal, and there were countries and boats drove through it. I don't know very much about it. I feel like that would be true. You know a great bit more than most of us. It's good to be humble,
Well,
though.
well, I try to keep my bullshitting to a minimum.
Yeah. Just sometimes meandering here and there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of scatterbrained, so I go off on tangents a lot.
That's fun.
Let's see. So, what do you think of the Turkish government denying the Armenian genocide? Will they ever concede that it happened? I mean, ever? I don't know about ever because that's a long time. Maybe someday, but probably not in the short to medium term. The problem the Armenians face is that there's not a lot of them. There's not a whole lot of Armenians that can really act as a large, influential community in a constituency in any country. And so as a result, it's kind of hard to put pressure on countries to in turn put pressure on Turkey on their behalf. And in lieu of significant political or diplomatic or economic pressure on Turkey to really engage in that conversation, probably not going to happen. I know Erdogan doesn't particularly care about that issue, and I know the Turkish military definitely doesn't care about that issue. And those are kind of the two major political groups. So what can you do? Probably my short answer is no. No, they probably will not concede it will happen in the near to medium term.
Well, this kind of fits with the Japanese denying the rape of Nanking and how, for any nationalist group, it's counterproductive to admit that your country did something wrong at any point.
Yeah, it's not. It doesn't really fit with the nationalist narrative
Yeah,
in any
which is
given
we're
country.
the best. Fuck all of you.
Yeah, pretty much in a nutshell. Building national cohesion, especially in a relatively new country, is very difficult. And so there's a strong desire to protect that narrative at all costs. Let's see. Is it true that the UAE is a ticking time bomb for economic collapse? I hear that oil resources are dwindling, projected to be totally gone in the next 20 years. Correct me if I'm wrong. I hadn't heard that, but I don't know that the UAE really depends on oil a whole lot. They've diversified pretty heavily into the financial sector, probably among others. That's why Dubai is so known for being a center of finance in the region, especially Islamic finance, such as it is. Uh, yeah, Dubai is the largest city in the UAE, so that's a big, significant part of the UAE economy. There was some confusion 10 some years ago. There was some company in Dubai wanted to buy a port in the United States, and somebody raised, well, not somebody, Congress raised national security concerns. And the debate in the United States was over whether Dubai should control ports in the United States. There seemed to be some confusion about whether Dubai was a country or a city. Most people seem to think it was a country. No, it's not. It's a city in the UAE. The UAE is kind of a weird country. It's actually, I think, 7 different countries. It's 7 different Emiratis who formed a union together, I think, in the 1960s or 1970s. Hence the name United Arab Emirates. And only one of those Emirates actually hosts Dubai. The others kind of have their own thing going on. But Dubai is easily the largest and most economically significant entity in the UAE. And even if oil production were to collapse in the UAE and the other Emirates were impoverished, they would still have Dubai there, and they could still emulate the example set by Dubai and its policies and the way that it attracted international finance and became internationally competitive in that regard. So it may be that parts of the UAE are extremely negatively impacted by any potential shortfall in oil resources that might happen. But I think in general, an economic collapse is probably pretty unlikely. They've got a good thing going for them in terms of being the region's center of finance. Does John Smith play StarCraft 2? John Smith does not play StarCraft 2. I have played it, but I played the single-player campaign because I'm terrible at multiplayer. Yeah, anything that involves people, I'm probably not great with.
No, dude, you were a great ship captain. What was that game?
Yeah, Red Alert, I think it was. Or something like that. I always mistake the name. Yeah, that's like a board game.
No, no, no. The Sky Captain game you play with Kukio. Where you're like in flying ships that are shooting at each other and stuff. That's multiplayer.
Guns of Icarus.
Yeah!
Yeah, Guns of Icarus was a lot of fun. Yeah, that was just being a pilot, though. If you really want to be a captain, you have to use the microphone and talk. Give orders and kind of tell people where to go, and I never did that. I just flew around and kind of hoped the crew knew what they were doing.
There was that other game that I watched you play that looked really cool. Endless Legend, I think, or something?
Yeah, Endless Legend, Endless Space, and I think there was another one, Endless Dungeon or something.
I played Endless Space a little bit on stream at one point. I really like that.
Yeah, we played that together, I
format.
think.
Yeah. Yeah, we did.
Yeah, briefly. It was like 1 week where we all played it together in the apartment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we all had an alliance together, and then I accidentally clicked the button that broke the alliance. Not my finest hour.
Likely story.
It's not my fault. I didn't mean to hit the button. Let's see. What happened to the Ottoman Empire's hold over the Middle East? Yeah, they were sick man of Europe. That's what they called them in the late 19th century. Yeah, basically after the Battle of Vienna in the late 1600s, they never really were able to kind of come back as a significant threatening power. Yeah, their power over the Middle East just sort of waned with the economic and political fortunes of the central Turkish government. Sort of was picked off over time by opportunistic European powers over the course of the 17 and 1800s. Yeah, I'm not quite as sure about their North African holdings, but in the Middle East's case, their gains, well, I guess that's more Europe too, though. Greek independence was one of the first significant territorial losses for, I think, the Ottoman Empire. To a lesser degree, Egypt. The thing about Egypt, though, is that the Ottoman hold over Egypt was always kind of tenuous, because they actually had the overall structure of the empire was kind of feudal, and so the Egyptian government was nominally autonomous. And because Egypt is such a wealthy and powerful region in its own right within the Ottoman Empire, they had a lot more discretionary power relative to other quote-unquote provinces, if you can call them that. And so they were almost nominally independent even, in the 1700s. And eventually they just broke away and stopped recognizing Ottoman authority over them, with the help of Europeans. So that wasn't too hard, as I understand it. Later on, European powers started helping independence movements, specifically in Greece. Greece was the big one. And then later on amongst other countries in the Balkan region. And the Turks were able to keep a hold over most of the rest of the Middle East. Outside of Egypt, anyway, they pretty much held on to everything until the end of World War I. And when they lost that, they pretty much lost everything. The British started a rebellion in Arab territories, ethnically Arab territories in the Ottoman Empire, with the assistance of the famous Lawrence of Arabia. And that rebellion successfully conquered broad swaths of Arab territory in the Ottoman Empire, partly with the help of the British Army, which kind of pressed from a different direction across the Suez Canal and up from Kuwait into the Euphrates and Tigris river basin. And with the pressure with that pressure occupying the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman army, the Arab rebel force was able to push up into the Levant and seize Damascus and a good chunk of what is now Saudi Arabia. So once that happened, the Turks had no real, You know, it was basically impossible for them to try to hold on to that in the Treaty of Versailles negotiations. So all of that was partitioned up into different countries. So they lost most of that territory in that manner. Basically, the Treaty of Versailles stripped them of all of that. They've still tried to exert some influence over the Middle East since then, but it's been difficult, partly because of the Cold War. The Cold War kind of dominated regional politics, obviously. So rather than being the Turks trying to exert their influence, it was mostly the United States competing with the Soviet Union for influence in the region, and the Turks were kind of along for the ride. Once the Cold War ended, then the Turkish government started getting more interested in re-exerting its own influence in the region. And that's kind of hit peak with the Erdogan regime in Turkey. Because Erdogan in particular wants to exert influence over the region. It's one of the reasons he got involved in Syria, which again, I don't think he thought would turn out the way it did. I think he thought it would be a quick intervention, that the rebellion would end very quickly with a new government in Syria, and that Turkey would, by virtue of its nominal intervention, would have a large influence on. That didn't pan out that way, but that speaks to the level of interest Erdogan has in having connections, or if you like, interfering in the affairs of neighboring states in the region. So let's see, what happened to the Ottoman Empire after World War I? Oh yeah, that's what I just answered. So there you go. And 2 Ottoman Empire questions in a row.
Nice.
So that's all the questions for now, so then I can... There's actually a lot of interesting stuff that happened over the past week. Had you heard about the Indian Supreme Court ruling on privacy?
Nope.
So there's this plan in India that's been pushed by Modi and the BJP, which is to create the largest biometric ID system in the world. Mm-hmm. And the idea is to give identifiable information to people in India who have not traditionally had it. Like here in the United States, we have social security numbers, which are handed out at birth. Mm-hmm. And then they give you access to government benefits and sometimes loans, you know, what have you, because they're so secure. They're explicitly identifiable with the people the numbers are assigned to. And so in India, they wanted to do something similar. But it's difficult in India because a lot of people don't register their births. Because there's a lot of poor people who kind of live on the margins of society, you know, in slums and rural areas that are isolated, places like that. So in order to give those people IDs so that they could have access or better access to government benefits, and also to a degree have access to the financial sector, which often requires that kind of information before they'll even consider giving you a loan, they came up with this plan to have ID numbers that were not associated with people per se, but rather with our biometric information. And the idea was that this would make it possible to register people and create a database that would be reliable and would be tied into overarching benefits and whatnot. So there was a question, though, about whether or not that would lead to abuses of power. Because at first, the program was entirely voluntary. You know, you could just volunteer and give up your biometric info, and then they would tie a number to it, etc. But then they started making it mandatory if you wanted any government benefits. And at that point, a question arose about whether or not the government could create profiles of people based on the ID numbers. Because the database is entirely controlled by the government. So hypothetically, they could seek out information based on your ID number from, you know, retailers or whoever else. Unlike in the United States, actually retailers in India will ask for this ID number because a lot of people who would otherwise not have access to certain services, like say certain phone services or what have you, they could buy things on their phone. And in order to make the phone account secure, phone companies will sometimes ask for this biometric ID number. That's my understanding of it anyway. And so then you can buy things through your phone, and then you can buy, you know, whatever. So whatever you buy from a retailer over your phone could then be tied back to you. So the government, using publicly or, you know, privately bought information, you know, this is kind of a big data conversation. So the government could get big data, basically, to get information on what you've been buying and then link that to your ID number. which they, unlike the private sector, can link directly to you or to your name. Well, I guess the private sector could do it too, but anyway, the privacy concern is that the Indian national government would have a giant database that it could use to profile people and that it would abuse the power. And so the Supreme Court ended up taking on a case that was brought by people critical of that, and the Supreme Court issued a ruling that said people do have a right to privacy. Because the whole crux of the government's defense against the claim was that actually no, the Constitution of India does not guarantee people privacy. And so what little privacy had been ensconced in the Indian legal system was basically being threatened with erase if the government had won this case. But they didn't. They actually lost. There is a right to privacy enshrined in the Indian Constitution, according to the Indian Supreme Court. And so that's a big victory for people who want that right to privacy and for people critical of massive government-run databases. It is a problem for the government, though, because they had been wanting to make this system mandatory, basically, over the long term. And now they kind of have to keep it voluntary, which is going to limit its effectiveness. Yeah, part of it was part of the idea behind the program was to bring people out of the informal economy, to give them access to normal avenues for finance and registering their property, etc., which would serve to make people less dependent on the black market, basically. It would have brought them into the formal system and increased tax revenue, since those people would then be able to start paying taxes.
But do they want to start paying taxes?
Probably not. But the payoff is that, you do have access to those resources. So whatever you're losing in taxes, you're kind of getting back in terms of more economic opportunities. But now the program is somewhat mitigated in effectiveness, so it's not really clear if the government will really still push it. So I thought that was an interesting event in terms of Indian legal history, for one, a right to privacy. Mm-hmm. Overarching conversation people everywhere are having about privacy and government surveillance and what have you.
I don't know if it got passed along, but we did get a cryptocurrency question again.
Let's see. Not yet. Can you comment on the divorce rate in America compared?
Oh, your mic's kind of cutting out a little bit.
There's a diet on me.
Oh, is it back?
Now it's back. Had to disconnect first.
Welcome back.
Is it coming through all right now?
Yep, loud and clear.
Oh, okay. So I don't know the divorce rates in other countries really well, so I can't do like a direct, statistical analysis comparing them. But in general, from what I've read, divorce rates in the developed world in general are higher than in developing countries. And I think part of that is the result of modernization. And that's not a positive or negative judgment. I'm not saying people who are more modern divorce more. I'm saying that it seems like when countries develop economically, one of the results is a kind of liberalization of the culture. And one of the symptoms of that is a higher divorce rate. You're kind of seeing this in China right now, which has not traditionally had really high divorce rates, but has seen them skyrocket since the economy has taken off. The impact of economic growth on societies and social norms is a pretty interesting topic. It was kind of the direction I was going in before I dropped out of the PhD program I was in. Yeah, the impact of economic growth really seems to be an atomizing effect. It seems to really destroy established social norms and traditions, including things like marriage. So in that sense, I can comment on that aspect of it. In America, the divorce rate became very high after, I want to say, the 1950s, right around that time. And I don't think it's any accident. That was also a period of very high economic growth. And since then, you've seen a similar pattern. Almost every other country that has developed economically has exhibited that same pattern of rising divorce rates. I guess you could say the exception would be the Middle East, but that's kind of economic growth, but it's very centered on one resource, oil. And so that type of economic growth is apparently not really conducive to that same effect of disrupting established culture. You know, the Saudi government has been moving towards diversifying their economy away from oil, so that might generate economic growth that disrupts their social norms in a similar fashion. But thus far, the way the Saudi economy has operated and developed, it hasn't developed in a way that's been particularly threatening to the Saudi culture, traditional Arabian culture there. Why did the European powers think it so important to prevent the Russians from ever having access to a warm weather port? Well, I mean, the obvious answer is just strategic considerations. Russia is a rival power, so naturally you don't want them to have access to a warm water port, because that just improves their economy, their access to trade, and gives them a all-weather naval base from which to project power across the seas. So that's the short, easy answer. In general, the Russians have always been an enemy of one or the other major European power. So there's always at least one power that's out to get them, so to speak. Historically speaking, that's not necessarily true now. That's a whole, relations between Russia and modern Europe and the United States, that's a whole other conversation we could have. But historically speaking, there's almost always been a rival somewhere that did not want Russia to have that kind of access. And so, I mean, that's just the sum of it, basically. There wasn't a whole lot they could do to stop them. The warm water ports that they ended up getting were in the Black Sea, and that was as a result of conflicts mostly with the Ottoman Empire, to a lesser degree with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But Europeans were not real gung-ho about the Ottoman Empire, and so we're kind of happy to see the Russians beat up on them, even if it meant they did get access to a warm water port. That changed later on in the, early mid-1800s, by which time the Ottoman Empire was no longer really seen as a threat. And so most other European powers started giving support to the Ottoman Empire in order to try to counter Russian expansionism. Which is why Istanbul is today still Turkish and not renamed Constantinople, because the Russians had seen conquering the city as a long-term goal. So did we, I'm not sure when we started. How much time do we have left?
I think
roughly speaking.
Let's see. About an hour?
Okay.
Assuming you want to be on for the same amount of time and Customers is on board.
Well, I'm flexible, whatever you need. I just wanted to know because I had a kind of longer topic.
Oh.
And I didn't want to go over the time limit, make you stay.
Oh, no. Go for it. I mean, assuming that's cool with Kesmetz. I guess he doesn't need to interact as much if you have a topic that's not question related.
We're kind of maxing out the questions.
Go for it.
Here's one more. Why does the U.S. consistently support Saudi Arabia given their various disagreeable behavior, like attacks on neighboring states, not to mention the government's support of Wahhabism? Yeah, so the American relationship with Saudi Arabia is, it's very much realpolitik. It's very strategic. I mean, basically, you could just put it simply and say oil. They have the Saudis have a significant reserve of oil and are a major producer, and so even though the United States produces a lot of oil now, anything that happens in Saudi Arabia that disturbs production, be it deliberate or not deliberate, would have a major impact on the global price of oil. So in that sense, the United States, even now, has a good reason to be involved in the region and with Saudi Arabia. You can go back further than that and say it actually started with the British. The British had been involved in the development of the Saudi oil industry. And they kind of, again, going back to the Ottoman discussion, the British were instrumental in the creation of a unified Arabian state in the wake of World War I. That was kind of the genesis of Saudi Arabia. I mean, kind of it goes into the 1920s too, but I won't go into too much detail there since I'm not that familiar with the details of Saudi Arabian history. But the British were de facto allies and protectors of the Saudi government against the Turks, and in order to ensure a supply of oil for their basically navy, as well as their economy. And so when the United States took over from Britain as global hegemon and defender of basically open, what's the phrase I want? Basically free use of the ocean, freedom of the seas, that's the phrase I want. Because the British had always couched one of their justifications for being a global hegemon was that they protected freedom of the seas, the freedom to travel and trade over the ocean. So when the United States took on that role after World War II, when the British were no longer really able financially to continue fulfilling that role, the United States kind of picked up where the British left off and also agreed to kind of protect the Saudis in exchange for a stable supply of oil. So the American interest was served in securing the supply of oil and ensuring stability in oil prices. And in turn, the Saudis gained a powerful protector so that they were not predated upon, so that they were not targeted basically by more powerful countries in their neighborhood, like, say, Iran or Turkey or whomever else. And that's pretty much been the basis of the relationship ever since. I think we talked a little bit in the first couple of weeks about the importance of the petrodollar and the whole conspiracy theory around that. But yeah, the root of the alliance is predicated in economic interests. And also, if the Saudis did become an ally of a different power, that would be a lot of money that other power would have access to. Petrodollars in the pursuit of strategic interests other than those of the West and the United States could have a potentially powerful destabilizing effect. So partly fear of Saudi money supporting somebody else, that's also a consideration. As for Wahhabism, I mean, Wahhabism is not the problem per se. It's more of a symptom, really. I think we've talked a bit about before about why the region's politics are so dysfunctional. But the crux of it is just bad governance. We've talked a bit about it before, but bad governance is bad governance. Sorry, is more the root cause of a lot of the region's problems than Wahhabism or what have you. Some of that is part of the problem. It does exacerbate it to a bit, but that's not an entirely fair assessment on the part of the Saudis. The Saudis would certainly argue with it. But I wouldn't go so far as to say they have no culpability either. There is some responsibility there on their part. But that's kind of beyond the scope of the question. The United States supports them in spite of that because the overarching economic and strategic considerations are much more important. And, that could lead into a conversation about the war on terrorism and why it's not really a central plank of American foreign policy, but I'll leave that for another day. Let's see. Why was the Ottoman Empire considered a European power despite it being a very Oriental culture in comparison to the other European states? I don't think the Ottoman Empire was really considered a European power per se. I think it was considered its own kind of civilization, its own entity. In so much as it was considered a European power, I think it was so because it had a substantial presence in Europe. The Ottomans conquered broad swaths of the Balkans. In fact, pretty much all of the Balkans, really, including a good chunk of Hungary, up to a good chunk of Hungary, and not too far from Vienna. And then almost all of Romania, as far east as Romania. And yeah, that's the principal reason I would think they would be considered a European power. They had a substantial presence in southeastern Europe. And for a long time, they threatened the rest of Europe as well. Like I was talking before, they had pushed on Vienna in the late 1600s and definitely gave the Europeans a run for their money. It really looked like they were going to take it for a while, and that they might even push into Central Europe. And then, let's see, the next one was, why was Russia so successful working with Syria to liberate Aleppo, but the US and NATO have not done anything decisive in Mosul in many months? Why was there less coverage of the high casualties in Mosul in mainstream media? The Russians were more successful in liberating Aleppo because they went full tilt. They didn't hold back. They're not interested in they're not as interested anyway. I won't say they're not interested in collateral damage, but they're not as interested in preventing collateral damage as, say, the Westerners, Westerners like the United States and European countries, which are very sensitive to casualties. The Russians are much more focused on getting things done, even if it's done quick and dirty, whereas the United States and Europe tend to be much more reticent. And the result is that their operations tend to be more clean, but also tend to be a bit less efficient. The Russians are very good about counterinsurgency when they really want to be. And in the case of Aleppo, they were. Also, they had a relatively strong local partner to work with in the form of the Syrian army. And they didn't put a lot of caveats on operating with them like the United States does with the Iraqi army. There's a real fear on the part of the United States government, and that goes back to the Obama administration, that if the United States unconditionally supports the Iraqi military and the Iraqi government, that a lot of the factors that pushed the Sunni Arab population in Iraq to revolt and open the way for the Islamic State, the conditions will not be fixed or changed, and there'll just be another revolt later on that the United States will also end up having to help with. So American support in Iraq is largely conditional in order to try to coerce the Iraqi government to try and reconcile with the Sunni Arab population there. So there's a lot of tension between that community and the largely Shia Arab government. There's a lot of mistrust there owing from the de facto Iraqi civil war that was kind of fought from 2006 onwards between Shia and Sunni in Iraq. And the government hasn't really done much to mitigate that lack of trust. In fact, it's done a lot to exacerbate it. So there's a desire on the part of the United States to try to actually fix the fundamental root of the problem, rather than just perpetually putting out fires, mowing the grass, so to speak. Just constantly putting down rebellion after rebellion without ever actually fixing the fundamental problem. The Russians were not interested in addressing the fundamental underlying problem. They just wanted to we've talked a bit about what the Russians want to do in Syria before, so I won't go too much into that. But, basically their interest was much more in just propping up an ally and trying to get diplomatic leverage vis-a-vis the Ukraine, and also to kind of bolster their vision for the region, which is more about empowering states as they are and trying to repress radical Islamist sentiment above and beyond addressing problems with governance that caused radical Islamist sentiment in the first place. That's much more their solution to the problem than the kind of American version, which is to pay more attention to fundamental underlying causes, in so much as those don't interfere with overarching American strategic concerns. Again, going back to the Saudi answer, there are conditions in which the United States would consider other things besides terrorism and governance to be more important, and they tend to prioritize those. And so then the other part of the question was, why was there less coverage of the high casualties in Mosul in mainstream media? I haven't been watching a lot of mainstream media. If I had to guess, I would say that there's not a lot of interest in Mosul or the war in Iraq in general. Most people probably, again, most Americans don't pay a lot of attention to a lot of that, to a lot of what goes on overseas, rather. So even if the United States is helping the Iraqi military in Mosul, people will pay a little bit of attention now and again, but overall, not a lot of interest. That would be my guess. I don't know exactly why the media would cover it any which way or give a certain amount of coverage to it. I guess the gist of the question is there hypocrisy there? Is it hypocritical for the media to talk about casualties caused by the Russians and the Syrian army in, say, Aleppo, but not cover so much the high casualties in Mosul. I'm assuming you're talking about civilian casualties and not military casualties with this question. For civilian casualties in Mosul, again, same issue, I would think, just lack of interest. And there's also a sense that the United States is the cleaner counterinsurgency fighter, that the United States is more interested in avoiding collateral damage, and so that what collateral damage is incurred must be the lower end of the spectrum. It must be that it was absolutely necessary. There wasn't anything that could be done to avoid it. Whereas with the Russians, there's less of a sense that they're as concerned about it, and so there's a sense that what collateral damage occurs maybe was not necessary and that it was needless. That's more of a reputation thing, in terms of the American and Russian reputations for how counterinsurgency is waged. And then somebody was asking for a resource about modern warfare. So you could do something like, I haven't done a whole lot of warfare stuff over the past couple years. You might try Small Wars Journal. That's a website that specializes in counterinsurgency. And then there's also, there's Long War Journal with Bill Raggio. I've been a little more skeptical of them, just because they seem to more just report what the military reports. Small Wars Journal is a little more critical. It's more of a kind of academic approach. They have a lot more viewpoints that offer alternative points of view in terms of how to approach counterinsurgency. About modern warfare. Strategypage.org. I haven't used them in a while, but back in the day, they used to be pretty good about giving the perspective of people actually in the military or engaging in operations like that. There's a lot of kind of formal news sites that focus on modern warfare, like defensenews.com. You might be able to tap some of them. Back when I was a kid, I used to like reading the Federation of American Scientists website, because they had a big chunk of the website was just like a big reference source for different types of hardware, military equipment, what have you. I think globalsecurity.org is kind of more the present go-to source for military equipment and, to a lesser degree, strategy and whatnot. If you're interested in that side, definitely give globalsecurity.org a try. They have a lot of good stuff there. I guess it kind of depends what you mean by modern warfare. If you're talking about hardware or strategy or politics or the economics, things like that, there are different sources you go to. But yeah, those would be the ones I could think of off the top of my head. Isn't the whole Syria thing geopolitical and also resources based? As in, several entities want to build an oil pipeline into Europe and Russia doesn't want that. I don't think resources based, because Syria doesn't have a lot of resources, and the pipeline thing is kind of an old... That was more relevant in the 50s, because the CIA actually sponsored a coup in Syria in the early 1950s, I think it was. And part of that was over an oil pipeline. But I don't think it's relevant now. Not so much, anyway. I doubt, it's probably true that the Russians would not want that, because that would just be an alternate source of energy for Europe, but I don't know that there's a whole lot they could do or would need to do to block it. The Syrian government, and especially with the insecurity in the region even before the civil war started, was pretty much enough to scupper that kind of deal. Nobody's going to build a pipeline in a region where there could be a civil war any moment, and certainly not when there actually is a civil war. And it's likely that any kind of peace agreement would... peace agreement in Syria is likely to leave some kind of frozen conflict in place. And I doubt anybody would really think that a safe enough environment for a pipeline. So Russia really doesn't have to do much in order to prevent it. What little they've done has been more than enough, but I don't think it's their primary motivation there. And is the whole thing geopolitical? I mean, partly, Erdogan, like I said earlier, probably, I don't know for sure, but I suspect he saw that as an opportunity to expand Turkish influence in Syria. But I don't think he intended to get stuck in a long, drawn-out proxy conflict like he has. I think that was a surprise. I think he probably partly thought the United States would bail him out. And one of the surprises of the Syrian conflict has been that the United States is kind of half-assing it. It's not really that interested. You know, its advice to its allies in the region has been basically do what you want, manage it how you see fit, but we're not getting too involved.
One of the things that you learn pretty straightforwardly from a game that's kind of a civ builder like Endless Space is it's very expensive to have a substantive change in a region that's very far from yourself. So it's kind of like, why would I commit stuff over there when there could be space pirates that attack me?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's really what it is. It's more of a regional conflict. You know, I think I've talked a little bit before about it, so I'll just kind of in short touch on it here. That the conflict in Syria is really a kind of proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. You know, Syria has long been an ally of Iran, and so when there was a rebellion there, the Saudis saw their opportunity to jump in. And that combined with the Turkish intervention, or interference rather, basically formed the rebellion. Or well, didn't form the rebellion, but propped up the rebellion. And then the Iranians supported the government. So the whole thing was a proxy conflict basically from the start. It started, well, to be fair to the Syrians, it did start as an indigenous thing. It was a conflict between Syrian groups, specifically rural Sunni Arabs, against the urban Alawite population along the coast. That was sort of the original genesis of the conflict, but then different powers got involved and it turned into that overarching proxy conflict. And then the Russians and the Americans kind of jumped in after the fact for their own reasons. But it's still, even now, mostly an Iranian and Saudi conflict. That would be my argument anyway. I'm sure somebody else would have a counter-argument to that, but that's my understanding of it as of now.
Well, that's one of the best things about a big clusterfuck is a lot of people can have different opinions and multiple people can be kind of correct.
Yeah. You know, that answer doesn't even touch on the Islamic State or the Kurdish question, which are just further complicating factors. So that's about it for questions then, at least for now, until someone new one comes in. So I'll touch on this thing, which I thought was pretty interesting. So in Cambodia, the government there has been is cracking down on a newspaper, and you know, the government has always been kind of iffy about its dedication to freedom of the press, freedom of speech, etc. But the government there is now being much more explicit in how it's cracking down. It's basically doing everything it can to shut down a newspaper that has long been very critical of the government. And you know, in general, that's a kind of a short story. Yeah, there it is, Cambodia. And you know, there wouldn't be much more to it than that. But I thought when reading the story, it was interesting that one of the reasons that the Cambodian government feels comfortable doing that much more explicitly than it would have done in the past is because of the economic influence of China. Before, and to a degree still now even, Cambodia has been very dependent on foreign aid in order to prop up its economy. But with so much money coming in from Chinese investment, it's not as dependent on foreign aid from the West. And as a result, the Cambodian government is not as sensitive to the preferences of Western aid agencies than it used to be. And so this is, as a result, kind of one of the secondary effects, so to speak, of the rise of China. Countries are less dependent on, don't have to basically cater as much to Western notions of human rights and liberal governance, liberal in the classical sense, as they used to, because the Chinese don't put such caveats on trade with, trade with them, basically. So they know that the Chinese investment money will keep coming, so they don't feel the need to go as easy on the political opposition, knowing that if Western aid is pulled, they'll still have that Chinese investment money.
Thinking about that in the context of North Korea, is North Korea in a way dependent on the existence of China being a strong economic powerhouse in the region who's willing to do business with people, kind of regardless of their governance?
Sorry, what was that?
Is the existence of North Korea as a hermit kingdom partially perpetuated by China's intervention, like their ability to engage with them economically when a lot of countries won't? If China wasn't so strong, how would they survive, basically, is what I'm asking.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they would, well, they would probably still be able to survive, but they wouldn't be able to survive in the same way. Like, the Chinese are basically the protectors of North Korea. North Korea would probably, well, definitely would not exist if not for China, because it was the Chinese that bailed them out in the Korean War when they were about to lose. And it's the threat of Chinese intervention that has pretty much been the primary deterrent to further efforts on the part of the West to try to resolve the issue whenever the North Koreans get a little too threat happy. But as far as them being a hermit kingdom, I think they would probably still be very hermetical regardless. You know, that's more of an endogenous development on the part of North Korean politics, specifically North Korea's Communist Party.
Behind you, Arissa.
So China is definitely very important to North Korea, but it's not the only thing that determines their behavior. Their behavior is mostly the same, but I think you are right. I think the overarching point you're making is, would they be able to survive without China? Definitely not, because they depend on them as that deterrent. It's part of the reason they probably want a nuclear weapon. If they have a nuclear weapon, they don't have to defend on China as much. So the nuclear weapon would not just be to deter the United States, it would also to make serve to make North Korea less dependent on the Chinese.
But the nuclear weapon doesn't really help them economically speaking. It just gives them that mutually assured destruction if someone's going to take action against them militarily.
Oh, okay, I see. So you're not talking so much about the security side, more the North Korean economy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it matters, because I think the North Korean government has a strong enough hold on power that they could probably, still hang on, even if they were cut off from the economic support that the Chinese offer. In that sense, the Chinese can bring pressure to bear through economic sanctions. That would have some meaning. But if, worst came to worst, and the North Koreans really thought they had to go it alone, economically speaking, they could do it. They wouldn't be able to maintain anything resembling a modern military. They already can't do that. But, what little they are able to maintain just would be unsustainable. At that point, they would be leaning really hard on, again, on the security side of things. So there was another question here. Did North Korea win, quote-unquote, the political drama banter between it and the U.S. in the sense that Trump has said a lot but clearly isn't willing to press the issue? I don't think they won it, per se. I would be skeptical of the notion that they won it. I don't think anybody won it, because I think it was just amateur hour on all sides. It's empty threats. And, exchanging empty threats is, well, vacuous. It doesn't mean anything. If one side wants to signal crazy, then you can't really do it if the other side does it too. One side has to play the straight man in that, so to speak. So I don't think North Korea really proved anything it hadn't shown before in terms of signaling its willingness to go toe-to-toe with the United States. And I don't think the United States gained anything by being bellicose in return. Basically the status quo is maintained. The only thing different is basically just the sound bites.
Yeah,
instead of the...
It was kind of like Trump playing their word games.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you're going to talk big? Okay, I'm going to talk big now.
Well, given Trump's personality, that's no great shock.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I read it. So I don't think it's substantive in that sense, and I don't think anything of substance in the North Korean situation and North Korean relations with the United States has been changed or really effective in any significant way by that exchange. And I don't think American or Trump's credibility in terms of his willingness to press the issue, so to speak, has been challenged. I don't think anybody is under the delusion that the equilibrium in the region is any different than it was before, and everybody knew it already. And that's part of the reason that previous American administrations had not been bellicose, because they knew that they had limited leverage to bring to bear on North Korea in terms of actually stopping them, and that they didn't really have the desire or willingness to exact a military option either. And so Trump talks big, but he's basically captured, basically, by the same calculus, the same lack of options. And so, in that sense, the principal outcome has been to reaffirm the status quo. And the other question was, what is the value of North Korea to China? The principal value is just as a buffer state between South Korea and China. And the reason that's important is because South Korea hosts American troops. China doesn't want military troops on its border. And hypothetically, if North Korea were to reunify with South Korea, there would be an American ally right there on the border, which they don't want. So that's the principal reason for it. It's also somewhat useful diplomatically, because China is the only country with significant economic leverage to bring to bear on North Korea. The United States, for example, pretty much has to lean on them to do something about, quote-unquote, about North Korea whenever there's some crisis regarding missiles or the North Korean nuclear program. And so, because of that, China can exert some leverage in other aspects of the Sino-American relationship. So there's been some talk about cracking down on China's trade surplus with the United States. But a lot of that has gone away since the North Korean crisis has played out, and since Donald Trump has met Xi Jinping, the president of, well, the nominal president of China, the head of the Communist Party in any case. And so ever since then, there's been much less talk about cracking down on trade with China. And to a degree, that's due to other factors, but it's also partly representative of the United States trying to cater to Chinese interests in order to compel them to use their leverage on China to do something about their nuclear program. So to expand a little bit on the rise of China, so the Cambodian story was kind of a lead-in to other examples, other implications of a more powerful China. You know, what impact will a larger Chinese economy and larger diplomatic presence in world affairs have? So one thing that happened, or one example of that, is in South Korea there was a big debate about THAAD missiles, the Theater High Altitude Air Defense missiles, that the United States developed to shoot down ballistic missiles. At the height of the North Korean dispute, crisis, whatever you want to call it, the United States said that it wanted to deploy THAAD missiles to South Korea in order to protect South Korea and Japan from ballistic missiles from North Korea. And so that missile deployment was very controversial, not only in South Korea, but in China. The Chinese government hated the idea of those missiles being there. And their argument was that the radar system that the missiles required would have allowed the United States to see deep into Chinese territory, to observe movements of aircraft in Chinese territory. And so they saw it as a very aggressive move and were very opposed to it. And in order to pressure South Korea over that issue, there was actually not an official, but a de facto boycott on a resort island in South Korea. And I shouldn't call it a resort island. It's basically just one of a few islands South Korea has. It's kind of a bigger island to the southwest of South Korea. And that island depends a lot on tourism for its economy. And a lot of Chinese will travel there because the South Koreans set up some kind of duty-free zone where you can buy things there without paying tariffs. So a lot of Chinese go there for cheap goods. So there was kind of a de facto boycott announced, and Chinese travel there fell off dramatically. And that's an example of how rising Chinese consumption and the power of the Chinese consumer can be leveraged to pursue China's political interests, or rather international foreign policy interests. And there was a similar kind of boycott announced after the death of a Chinese man in a hostage situation that developed in the city of Manila in the Philippines. Some gunman of some sort took a number of hostages, including some Chinese, on a bus, and ended up killing one of them in a kind of botched operation by the Filipino Special Forces, or whatever their equivalent thereof would be. And so some Chinese were very upset about that and declared a boycott of the Philippines, vowed not to travel there. I don't know that that was all that impactful, and I don't think the Chinese government is as interested in that, but that speaks again to the power of the Chinese consumer, that that would be a credible threat, something that the Philippines was concerned about and could impact their economy. And then they've also, China is also definitely, explicitly the Chinese government in this case, has used China's economic heft to try to influence countries in ASEAN. Again, I'm not sure what the pronunciation is supposed to be. ASEAN is it stands for Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and it's kind of a sort of very loose, decentralized international organization of Southeast Asian states that get together to coordinate on international relations and economic development. And China has put pressure on the nations in that group over the South China Seas dispute, the territorial dispute over islands and economic exclusionary zones in the South China Seas. And, it's already has very explicit disputes with certain countries in the organization over islands in the region, but not with all of them. And the ones that do not have a direct dispute with China over those islands have received a lot of pressure from China. Diplomatic pressure mostly for now, in order to not side with those countries that do have disputes with China, in order to prevent the emergence of a coordinated bloc of Southeast Asian countries that negotiate together to stand against China and its claim over the region. And one example from Malaysia that I thought was interesting, there was a protest that had been planned, an anti-Chinese protest in Malaysia. We can talk sometime about Malaysia's ethnic tensions or race relations. That's an interesting topic. But anyway, there was an anti-Chinese protest planned, and the Chinese ambassador actually joined a counter-protest, which is a very bold move for a Chinese ambassador. Normally, Chinese ambassadors to countries are very low-key. China prefers not to really play its hand too strongly, or at least too openly, rather, in examples like that. But in Malaysia's case, the Chinese ambassador very openly came out and explicitly sided with counter-protesters and talked about, equality and not hating Chinese people, basically. But he also said something interesting, which is that China would intervene if its interests were threatened. And that was a very bold signal on the part of the Chinese government that it was considering, at least, taking a more active role overseas and protecting whatever it deemed to be in its national interest.
I think that kind of a point of gravity for that interaction is the emphasis in Chinese culture on your connections rather than taking new risks, which is more of our, especially American Western perspective, is what new deals can I make with new people that are going to pay off right now, as opposed to the Chinese perspective, which is more about the stability of your connections over time, who you know and what favors they can do for you.
Yeah, in politics and to a lesser degree in business, the Chinese are generally relatively risk-averse, and partly that's because of the political environment they have to operate in, which there's not a lot of certainty in Chinese business because they lack the same degree of rule of law that exists in the West, and which acts as a kind of a guarantor of fair play and market competition. To some degrees greater. In some countries it does that to a greater degree than in others, but largely, for the most part, economic agents in the West feel pretty safe operating in business and are more risk tolerant. But lacking that same advantage in China, businessmen are more risk averse, and as you say, they depend a lot more on guanxi, on their networks, in order to guarantee, to provide that level of security that they can't get from the state and from the legal system. So then another example, I had a whole bunch of these. So Laos actually leased land to Chinese developers which you would never, which could not happen with a European developer. Like a country in the developing world leasing land to a Western developer would be anathema. You know, nationalists would go batshit. Because it's China, it's not as sensitive. And so a chunk of land in Laos on the border, specifically near the border with China, was leased to a development company so they could develop the land, and basically turned it into a kind of resort. So that's an example, of, again, of the power of Chinese investment money. Countries would do things for Chinese investment money they would not do for their European equivalents. And then, have you heard of the One Belt, One Road initiative?
One Belt, One Road. No.
Yeah, it's basically this big, giant development program the Chinese government is helping pay for that's developing the infrastructure in a whole shit ton of countries around the world. And it's an immense effort on their part. It's, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars. And, well, over time anyway. It certainly ranks in the tens of billions of dollars, at least for now. But it's going to expand over time. And kind of in the same way that, you know, for much of recent history, a lot of infrastructure in the developing world was built by aid companies or maybe a few Western investors. And so a lot of people in the developing world look around at the infrastructure and say, oh, that's left over from colonial times, or that was built by an aid agency, etc. Increasingly in the future, people are going to the developing world to look at their infrastructure and say, that was built by the Chinese. And a lot of that is part of the One Belt, One Road initiative. And it's expanding China's diplomatic and economic clout in the developing world immensely, because they don't really attach many conditions to the aid money they send or the projects. Mostly they just kind of do as they will. You know, if you want the money, just say yes and we'll come and build it. Whereas with the West, there's a lot of conditions and caveats generally attached to them. So the One Belt, One Road initiative and the explosion in investment from China into the developing world will have a big impact in the future. And not only in terms of Chinese influence, also in terms of economic development in the developing world, because a lot of the developing world really needs that infrastructure that they're building there. And so that infrastructure building spree could really help lead to an economic boom in a lot of areas.
It's definitely a thing that we take for granted a lot in the US, and other developed countries have like great road systems and whatnot. But just the vast amount of distance you can cover as an individual, but also the goods and equipment and stuff that can be transmitted by trucks and what have you. So there's just a lot more fluid. It kind of brings the country together in a sense. You're not as limited by the geographical distances.
Yeah, infrastructure, transportation infrastructure specifically destroys space and time. It makes it much cheaper and easier to travel much faster and longer distances, and so that creates economic ties that could not exist otherwise, and creates social ties that could not exist otherwise, like you say. So it's very important for creating a single national market, not only in business, but also in ideas. And identities, I should add.
Kind of related to the transportation thing, I saw your post on Facebook about the Japanese population just abandoning rural villages and stuff on a massive scale, and basically just the elderly are left there, and kind of the implication of how far is this going to go? Is it just going to be Japan is now a city-state that is like Tokyo and what's the other main city? But it's all basically concentrated around the bullet train, which was a cool little graphic.
Yeah, the Japanese demographic implosion continues unabated. There's no clear solution to how to restore birth rates to at least replacement level, if not also a growth level. And the spatial implication is that vast swaths of rural Japan are just emptying out, and it has really interesting implications for Japan's agricultural sector. Because in the article I posted, what I read was that the average age of the Japanese farmer now is like something like 66 years old, which is very old for a farmer. You know, being a farmer is hard work. That's a pretty old age to be doing that. So I think there's a real question as to what Japan's agriculture will look like once that population starts retiring.
Mm-hmm.
You know, who's going to replace them, if anyone?
Robots.
Well, robot, yeah, that's possible. They could innovate automated agriculture. That would be an interesting development. But I mean, it could be that they just import all their food. You know, they produce enough goods and services in their urban centers, they could just import all of it. So, I don't know, maybe they just turn the rest of Japan into a vast wildlife preserve. Who's to say?
They actually kind of presented that a little bit in the anime series Psycho Pass, where the agriculture industry is purely managed by huge, like, robot-piloted tractors, basically. Everything has been automated. There's no need for humans to even be in the rural areas. They produce all their own food, but there aren't really any humans who are necessary for that industry anymore. Everyone lives in the cities.
Where was this?
It's called Psycho Pass. It's an anime.
Oh, Psycho Pass.
Yeah.
Which one was that?
I don't know if I watched it with you. The premise of it is it's set in the future, maybe 50 to 100 years ahead. And using a gun technology, they can point at someone and read their crime potential. Just the state of their psyche and how likely they are to commit crime. So it's a little bit like Minority Report, but they have what's effectively a mobile device for evaluating that. And the evaluation of crime in general becomes automated by this system, which it's kind of a quest of the police officers to find out how the system works, how people are evaluated, and what the implications and problems might be of that. So it's kind of like people managing their psychology with more metrics that can be measured by these new technologies.
Gotcha.
It's really good.
That.
It's very dark, but it's very good.
Yeah, you recommended that to me, and I watched the first season.
Mm-hmm. There's only one season. They're making a second one.
I thought there was a second.
Maybe it came out. It wasn't out when I watched the first one.
I think it was coming out when I was watching it, because you mentioned the episodes were being released weekly, I think.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, it's been a while, but I think that's. I think they did make it, and it's out there somewhere. I'm sure some website somewhere probably has it, probably of dubious legality. So let me see. There was a question here. How much of your education was focused on historical events, and how much was focused on recent, current, future happenings? I don't have a whole lot of formal education in history and current events. Current events is mostly self-taught. I had some history in college as an undergrad, and then I had a lot more current events type stuff in grad school that I took kind of on my own initiative. I had a couple classes on Latin America. I had a couple classes. I had a class on, well, one class on Latin America. I had another class on national security, or rather terrorism specifically, but that was kind of broadly interpreted into national security. I took as an undergrad, an international relations course, actually with Kukio. Kind of bonded over that for a while. It's part of how we became friends. And yeah, sundry other things. You know, I mean, some courses aren't explicitly about current events type things like economics, national security, but can be tied into them. And so for class projects and things, I would, you know, kind of look into that aspect. And again, a lot of it is self-taught, just read on my own. You know, there's a lot of information out there if you want to find it. You know, we live in an era where the sum total of human endeavor, intellectual endeavor and knowledge is at your fingertips. So if you really want to learn something, there's not a lot stopping you short of lack of access to the internet.
Yeah, so to put it in perspective, I lived with Agent Smith, and some people have hobbies where they want to play games a lot, or they want to watch streams or watch TV shows and stuff. Agent Smith watches documentaries and reads news articles like as his fun thing to do. Most people would consider that work, but he likes it and thinks it's really cool. So a lot of that knowledge isn't just, oh, I learned all of this in university and I was taught it by a professor. This is fun. And it's kind of cool to see the volume of your knowledge with that as a hobby, where you enjoy it. It's not just, I need to know this for my next test. It's, I like knowing what's going on in the world.
Yeah, you know, it's like a soap opera that never ends. There's always something interesting going on.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, so there was... Eisenhower did all that highway building, didn't he, to move nukes? Yeah, this is a reference to President Eisenhower of the United States, and a big infrastructure building project that he helped push through in the 1950s. I wouldn't say Eisenhower did that, that was more Congress, and then Eisenhower helped push it and then signed it. So that was definitely a national effort on the part of all parties involved. But yeah, that was mostly for economic purposes. You know, it was pretty clear that the Autobahn in Germany had positive economic impacts, you know, whatever the political symbolism may have been. And clearly a big benefit, and so the United States decided to kind of do something like that. It also served to kind of like what Neuro and I were talking about before. It served to tie together the country's different markets into a single national market and help bolster the nation's identity as a singular one nation. And to move nukes, yeah, there's kind of this persistent notion that the highways, the freeways rather, were designed in a way that would allow B-52 international bombers, I'm sorry, intercontinental bombers rather, to land on them in the event of a conflict, or other aircraft, if necessary. I don't know if that's entirely accurate. That might be an urban legend. But there might be some truth to it. They certainly are designed broadly to be very large. But I don't think defense was ever the principal consideration. I think it was principally an economic project. And it was very successful. Today, it had a significant spatial impact on the American economy. Because today, most economic centers around the country, and most businesses for that matter, go out of their way to be located near freeways of one sort or another. So kind of like rivers used to be, now highways are the center mode of trade. That's the principal avenue around down which people move in order to move goods and services. So I had a few more of these China Rising examples. There was a scandal in Zambia in Africa. I shouldn't call it a scandal, but it became Chinese investment and political influence by way of that investment, principally through a mining company, if I recall, became a political issue in a presidential election there. And the opposition candidate made a big to-do about how close the incumbent president was to Chinese mining concerns and how much money he was getting from them. So that's an example of Chinese economic interest influencing political developments in a developing country. Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about Pakistan already and how being able to rely on the Chinese economy and Chinese support and investment helps them kind of acts as a counter to American pressure and influence. Talked a little bit about how North Korea is leverage that the Chinese can use to dissipate some American pressure on the trade surplus.
I think someone in the chat was saying that if Korea were to be unified, that would be to the benefit of the US. And I'm guessing that's because the South Korean economy is much bigger, so a unified Korea is going to be more like a South Korea with kind of an East Germany situation, where they have another side that's added in that's not as strong economically, but they can kind of carry the weight, and it's more like West Germany than East Germany overall. Would that be the case if it were unified?
No, I mean, we talked a little bit about it. I mean, I still think it would be a big drain on Korea overall, because mostly, I mean, East Germany has never caught up with West Germany, and the West German government, or the West German part of Germany, spent an immense amount of money trying to get East Germany up to speed economically, and despite all of the billions of Deutschmarks, as they were then, being spent on it, it's never really caught up, and it kind of remains economically depressed even today. Parts of it are doing better, but in general it lags behind the rest of Germany. So North Korea would probably be like that, only even worse. Because North Korea is a lot worse off than East Germany ever was. And there's a question about political stability in the event of all those North Korean voters voting in Korean elections. How would they vote? You know, it's not exactly clear how they would react to being introduced to a democratic political system. So there would be a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty upsets markets. That alone would create a lot of problems. But then the sheer cost of trying to upgrade and update and modernize the North Korean economy would be just immense. So I don't think it would be a huge gain for Korea. Maybe it would be a strategic gain for the United States in that it wouldn't have to worry about something happening in the North Korean government that results in some North Korean attack on Seoul, or maybe a nuclear exchange of some kind. In that sense, it would be beneficial. But it might not be as beneficial as you might think, because a Korean unification kind of mitigates the need for American presence in Korea, or for that matter in Japan. So actually the long-term result of impact of the Korean unification could be a reduction in the American presence in the region and a lessening in the dependence of Korea on America, and in turn a lessening in the power of American influence in the region. So something else about China. China has a lot of requirements, imposes requirements on foreign investors regarding local content requirements, local partnership requirements, and technology transfers. And some of those are odious, especially in the context of a market that doesn't really have rule of law like a lot of Western investors are more comfortable with or more used to. But a lot of companies will tolerate that treatment, what they see as discriminatory treatment, because the Chinese market is so large. You know, they figure that however much money they might lose in the long term, or however discriminatory the treatment might be, it'll be worth it if they can tap the Chinese market, because that's a huge number of consumers. So in that sense, that's an example of the influence of Chinese money even influencing the behavior of Western corporations, which normally have a reputation of being very domineering with regard to their investments in other countries. And even Facebook did that. I read a story not long ago about them creating a censorship tool that would allow officials to keep posts from appearing on people's news feeds. That's a direct quote from the headline. In specific geographic areas. And so even Facebook, in order to get that market, is willing to compromise on some of its ideals. Nominal corporate ideals, anyway.
Interesting.
And then there's another requirement. Foreign companies have to store their data within China so that the government can demand it if they want it.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, naturally, a lot of countries do that. And then there's Hollywood self-censorship. You know, Hollywood doesn't like to make movies now that are too offensive to China for fear of upsetting favorable regulations in China. Because right now there's a lot of limits to how many movies can be released in China. And so in order to try to get on the good side of the Chinese government, they try not to put anything too anti-China out there. For example, there was a movie made called Red Dawn in the 80s about a Soviet invasion of the United States. They remade that movie. That movie was remade in the 2010 or something. And instead of the Soviets, it was the Chinese that invaded America. Well, Hollywood wasn't entirely comfortable with that, but for some reason they didn't get uncomfortable until after the movie had basically already been made. So they actually went back in and edited out all of the references to China, and basically used a lot of CGI and whatnot to replace them with North Koreans.
Huh. It's a funny example of film being influenced by international relations.
Yeah.
Well, so we want to make art, but we also want to be on China's good side at the same time.
Well, I mean, it's a business first and foremost.
Yep.
There's a lot of business to be had over there.
Yep, they have all the dollars now.
So we had a couple more questions. My thoughts on the situation in Venezuela, what actions can be taken, what's happening to people, protesters, etc. I'm not entirely sure what the Venezuelan government's game plan is. Well, when I say the Venezuelan government, I mean the Maduro administration, specifically the Chavistas. they seem to have set up what is de facto at this point a one-party state. Technically, the National Assembly is still there and is controlled by the opposition, but like we talked about last week, they've been sidelined by the Constitutional Assembly, which voted to seize the powers of the National Assembly, and is effectively Venezuela's new legislature, and is completely controlled by the Chavistas. I don't know if they want that to be a permanent thing, if they want to return at some point to democracy, to have democratic elections at some point again, or if this is just a power grab and that this is a permanent state of affairs, basically. I don't know, and it kind of remains to be seen. I haven't really seen it. I haven't followed it closely enough to discern any signals one way or the other there. They could, hypothetically, if they wanted to, just turn Venezuela into the next Cuba. You know, they've got control of the police, they've got control of the military, and there's also a system of rations that are controlled by the military and by local coordinating committees, as they're called, which are basically arms of the Maduro administration, basically arms of the Chavista political party, and can give or decline to give food aid as they see fit, which is another way of saying if you're a political opponent, don't expect to get fed, at least not if you're in an area where your principal source of food and resources comes from these coordinating committees. So, I mean, they could go for authoritarianism if they wanted to at this point, but I don't know if they have a desire to do that, given how much unrest it would cause. What actions can be taken? I don't know. I don't think the United States can do much, because the United States doesn't have a lot of credibility in Latin American politics. In fact, the Maduro administration has made a lot of hay of the Trump threat to use sanctions and possibly military force. That's something almost everybody in Venezuela, I think, is opposed to. On the other hand, interference or intervention by Colombia, for example, or maybe some other Latin American state might be more welcome. But in general, almost every Latin American country is very averse to any kind of intervention, anything that would violate sovereignty. So I don't know if even that is very likely. Most likely, the only principal thing that can be done, and certainly the most effective thing that could be done, would be done inside the country by the Venezuelan people themselves. I don't think they can expect any white knight on a horse to come from outside the country to save them. You know, whatever happens now is pretty much in their hands. It just depends on them. That might not be the answer some people there want to hear, but, you know, that's pretty much the truth. You know, there's a saying in international relations that countries have the governments they deserve, which is a way of saying that it's better to just let countries be as they are and deal with the governments they have than trying to change the governments to suit your wants or needs. It just gets really messy when countries start trying to overthrow each other's governments.
It's interesting kind of thinking about the one-party versus two-party system, and how even if you don't agree with a lot of the principles of the second party, it kind of keeps your party competitive in the sense that they're kind of vying for the vote of the public, and they're trying to evolve and adapt to beat out the other. And if you have a single party, they have the monopoly. They don't really have to tighten up their screws to win the next election. They know that they're winning, and they're going to continue to win.
Yeah, you know, political monopolies are like economic monopolies. There's no reason to try, no reason to compete if you know you're not going to have any competition.
Mm-hmm.
There actually was a second part to the question I didn't see. And why has there been such a lackluster response when it's a major source of oil? Yeah, it's true that it's a major source of oil, but the oil industry is not very efficient, and production, I think, is actually flagging now because of the lack of investment. It turns out the Venezuelan state oil agent company was not very good at maintaining and expanding the oil industry in Venezuela. They had been kind of depending on their foreign counterparts, foreign oil companies that had had a stake in Venezuelan oil, in the Venezuelan oil industry, to kind of carry out maintenance and improvements. And once that's gone, once they left rather, things started to kind of fall into disrepair. And it didn't help that the Venezuelan government diverted a lot of resources that should have gone into maintaining the oil industry into political activities, basically. And so they still produce a lot of oil, but I think there's a sense that if you want the oil, they're almost certainly going to sell what they have regardless. You know, they're producing less oil than they did before, so it's not as much of an issue. And also, when you're a country with a collapsing economy and the only thing you have of value is oil, it's pretty much guaranteed you're going to sell that oil. So if you're a foreigner and you're worried about where your oil supplies are coming from vis-a-vis Venezuela, you know, you don't have to worry so much because you're definitely going to have access to it. You know, they're going to do everything they can to get that oil out there.
Mm-hmm.
So since oil is the principal thing people are interested outside of Venezuela anyway, not a lot of interest in doing anything. You know, it's not like Saudi Arabia where they're like this massive producer who can single-handedly affect prices. And it's not like the conflict is likely to really spread outside of Venezuela, assuming it even turns into a conflict, a civil war or some such. But it's not at that level yet. Maybe if it did, there would be more interest in doing something. But right now, it's still mostly a political crisis. And doesn't look like it's going to spread or significantly disrupt oil supplies. Am I keeping you up? I hope I'm not dragging this out too much.
No, dude. I've been going ham, so since Pact has been out of town, I've been doing like 13-hour streams or so. So I'm by no means being dragged out. This is nice.
Okay.
It's good to have your time. I think it's the combination of not just us talking, but it's also the person who's kind of interfacing with the chat. That's one of the limiting factors from just being on all the time. But yeah, it's great having you on, and this will be another episode exported to the YouTube channel. This would be the 5th one, I think.